Hello and welcome to another episode of the New Discourses podcast. This is James Lindsay, and I am doing something for you that you've been asking for a long time today. And what I'm doing today is the basics of cultural Marxism. Now, when we talk about woke Marxism and Marxism more generally, there are a lot of subjects to cover. And I think we could probably build entire university style, not just courses, sequences, curricula around all of the different topics. And as a matter of fact, what I want to do today is to kind of break into four pieces a rough introduction to cultural Marxism, which is just one phenomenon. And just to disclaim, cultural Marxism is a fraught term. Cultural Marxism has been declared by the powers that be a conspiracy theory, and in particular an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The claim is that the people who just notice things, as they call themselves on the internet today, because they are in resurgence, happened to notice that the members of the Frankfurt School in particular, which is one of the dimensions of the cultural Marxism or Western Marxism phenomenon, were all ethnically Jewish, although they were not, as a matter of fact, practicing or observant or certainly Orthodox Jews in any regard. As a matter of fact, their religion was communism. They would have promoted, not quite to a man because of Walter Benjamin, but they would have promoted broadly atheism as a kind of baseline, and then a faith of utopian communism or socialism, depending on which ones we're talking about. I don't know that Max Horkheimer, for example, was particularly bent on a utopian vision, but Herbert Marcuse was most definitely bent on a utopian vision. He said so himself in his own words. So it's difficult to talk about cultural Marxism, and this is my little disclaimer at the beginning, and then I'll kind of talk more about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and get to the meat of this. It's difficult to talk about cultural Marxism because it is labeled an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, believing that people who just notice things have pointed out that the Frankfurt School was overwhelmingly, if not entirely, ethnically Jewish, and that they had a plot to destroy Western civilization. That is the so-called anti-Semitic cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. Here's the thing. There are a lot of elements of truth to that. However, there are also a lot of incorrect elements, like I just said. These people, what's incorrect? Their religion was not Judaism. Their religion was communism, very clearly, and in somewhat different stripes. They were Marxists, which is something that you can see Marxists who pretend to be Christian or who use Christian motifs. You can see Marxists who pretend to be whatever religion they have to be in order to fit in. So it's not anything to do with their Judaism. That's kind of an important incorrect point. Now, what is true is that they were from Jewish families, and they did have a plot to destroy Western civilization. But that plot did not grow out of their Judaism. That plot grew out of their communism. So the conspiracy theory often has to deal with this uncomfortable debunking fact by going backwards a step and saying communism itself is a apparently correct expression of the Jewish mentality, the Jewish ethnicity, which apparently is attached to that mentality, or the Jewish faith, which is starkly wrong. But that is, anyway, the conspiracy theory. So that makes it difficult to talk about cultural Marxism. I, for instance, have a Southern Poverty Law Center profile claiming that I am general hate and an anti-government general, and it spends a fair amount of time, as does my probably intelligence-produced Wikipedia entry, spending a significant amount of time saying that I peddle the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. Unless you think, I think this is, of course, amusing. I think it's credentialing to have an SPLC profile. But as it turns out, it does cost you in real life. You do not get invited to the nicer of the nice things in the world because of having an SPLC profile, which is a problem. And they know it, and that's why they do this. And one of the primary accusations against me is that I traffic in the so-called cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. They're so dedicated to people not knowing what cultural Marxism is, that they replaced the original entry for cultural Marxism on Wikipedia with one called Cultural Marxism Conspiracy Theory about 4 years ago. I remember using the previous entry as a source. You can still obtain that by now through a link on the Conspiracy Theory website. But if you actually type in cultural Marxism into Wikipedia, you get taken to a claim that it's a conspiracy theory first and foremost. And I used the original as a source when I was first starting out. I mean, I don't remember when, 2000, it could have been as early as 16, 15, but certainly by 2020, I was looking into that because that's also 2019 is when I got introduced to Herbert Marcuse and his writing. So 2019 is when I started to look into all of that. So certainly by 2020, I would have been looking. And they changed, possibly, at least partly as a result of my work, they changed the Wikipedia landing page for cultural Marxism. But this is going to be an introduction to the basics of cultural Marxism. That means it's going to be an overview, and I'm going to kind of elaborate on why I'm doing this. I've been asked for years, will you make a basics program? Will you make something easy? I get asked routinely if I was going to send somebody to a first place to land. And if you're listening, I want you to pay attention to this and remember it. If you were to tell somebody what's the first piece of your work they should engage with, what would it be? I get asked that all the time. Well, here you go, boys and girls, the basics of cultural Marxism. That's this episode. This is meant to be a starting place for people who want to start to understand what has happened in our world over the last century or so that has set the stage for the woke movement and everything that we're dealing with the Marxist attack on society. And in fact, if they're at the point of wanting to understand the rapidly growing reaction that is stepping into the trap devised by the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory type people, then this is the starting place to understand the actual historical reference of cultural Marxism. So this is just an overview of kind of the big picture story presented at a fairly basic level. This is a starting place for people looking for one. This is not going to be the deep, deep dive. If I have time and there's interest, I might do that. I might turn this into a multi-part, I'm thinking 5-part series, where this is the first of the 5, in which I explore each of the following 4 units. So I have 4 units I'm going to cover, and I could take each of these following 4 units and expand each one of them with details and accurate quotations that I read, like I do in my workshops, for those of you that have attended my workshops. In fact, most of the quotes I would use, I would pull from the workshop notes that I made, and do those as individual podcasts if there's interest. So, like, if we thought of this as a university structure, let's consider this to be 101, and those would be like 201, 211, 221, 231, or whatever. In other words, this is like the freshman introduction. Those would be like the sophomore survey courses. Now, the fact is that those would still be survey courses, and we could do literally, if we really wanted to, we could do an entire semester where this is just the first lecture, or first and second lecture, depending, because it's going to be long. And then there are several further lectures that go into tremendous amounts of depth about each of these characters, each of these books. You could do I could do an entire series, and I have done series on just single essays, like Repressive Tolerance was a 4-essay series. Essay on Liberation was a 4-essay series. We could do a very long or very short, depending on what you wanted to hear out of it, essay series on Max Horkheimer's creation of critical theory. There are lots and lots of things to say. The prison notebooks from Antonio Gramsci, which are going to come up in this, are over 3,000 pages long. We could make as much information as we wanted to. History and Class Consciousness by George Lukács is a very difficult to read book that's in the excess of 300 pages. We could make entire courses out of each subject I'm going to touch on within this. So I'm just telling you that to really give you the sense that what I'm about to give you, because I know how the world works, in particular I know how the internet works, is a surface level introduction to the history and basics of cultural Marxism. And that I may proceed to do a still shallow but deeper dive into each of 4 units. The 4 units for this workshop, I guess, or this podcast, this episode, the 4 units that I'm going to present are: first, Marxism and its historical context. We can't actually talk about the basics of cultural Marxism without understanding something about Marxism. And we can't talk about why cultural Marxism occurred at all without understanding the historical context of the failure of Marxism in its original sense. Secondly, I'm going to talk about a thing that actually carries the label, historically, cultural Marxism. Western Marxism could be a catch-all for these various views by units 2, 3, and 4 for this particular podcast. But cultural Marxism is the right name to describe the thing that was happening roughly in the, I guess, 1910s and 1920s into the early 1930s, maybe through the middle of the 1930s, primarily within Western Marxism. Third, I'm going to cover critical Marxism, which is also sometimes referred to, or usually referred to, as the critical theory. And so the critical theory was developed in the Frankfurt School by Max Horkheimer in 1937, and it is a diversion. It is a different track from the rest of Western Marxism. It takes the cultural Marxist kind of underpinning and takes it in what it hoped would be a more productive direction that is in fact even more negative in its general theology, and takes it off in a direction that to this day is still a vibrant school of thought, although it's less than it once was. And there was a massive and important split within the the critical Marxism vein that leads us into, and this would have been in the 1960s, really, going into the 1970s, maybe even by the 1980s, that goes into what I'm going to consider the fourth of these units, which is woke Marxism or intersectional Marxism, which is really cultural Maoism or American Maoism or intersectional Maoism, but the importation of Maoism and identity politics becomes the defining characteristic of that. And so once again, the four units are the historical context in which cultural Marxism arose, with a brief introduction to Marxism itself in probably a way you're not used to hearing, as Unit 1. Unit 2 will be cultural Marxism itself. Unit 3 will be critical Marxism. And Unit 4 will be woke Marxism, which we could give a variety of names to. So let's dive in. I'm just going to say that this, again, one more time, this is the overview podcast. I'm just going to talk about these things. I'm not going to go into a deep dive. I'm not even going to go into a shallow dive. It's like if we're at the pool, we're putting our feet in, looking at the water, drinking a margarita, and kicking our feet. We're not getting in the shallow end. We're not splashing around, and we're definitely not swimming laps, and we're definitely not diving to the bottom. That is a completely different project. And if this is interesting enough and we find time and energy, given all the other things we have to do, maybe I'll take each of these four units and expand them and do full-length podcasts on each, and then you will have a, level 1 or level 100 and level 200 introduction in 5 pieces, or maybe it's just going to be the one, who knows, that you can send to people and say, this is where you should start with James's work to understand what he's talking about. Okay, so Unit 1, Marxism and its the historical context in which cultural Marxism arose. So Marxism is a religion. That's the first sentence that we need to cover. The summation of that faith, actually, and you think I'm making a joke, and I'm not making a joke, the summation of that faith can be summarized in a very famous sentence now that does not come from Karl Marx, despite memes on the internet misleading you to believe that it does. And that sentence is being able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. Of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, at least at the time of this recording, she's Vice President Kamala Harris says that a lot, and has said that a lot for years. I, again, reiterate, Karl Marx did not, to my knowledge, anywhere write that. He's written so much stuff, it's possible it's somewhere, depends on the translation from the German, but to my knowledge, he's never written that explicitly. There are many expressions in the Marxist canon from Marx himself and others that sound an awful lot like that, or that express that sentiment. So I believe it is in fact the beating heart of the Marxist religion, is being able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. It's a romanticism toward an idealized future. So it's the worst of French Romanticism as a philosophical school combined with the worst of German idealism as a philosophical school. and you idealize the future into a literal utopia or a state of the Garden of Eden on earth, or kingdom of God on earth, called communism, which is a stateless, classless society in which from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs is the distribution method. So you're able to see that as something that can be, but you have to be unburdened by the weights of your past. The closest expression, while it's in the Marxist canon frequently, the closest expression from Karl Marx, at least, is overwhelmingly in the first chapter, right at the beginning. You can look this up. It's for free online. It's in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And I mean, that's a lot of words you're probably not familiar with, but Brumaire is spelled Brumaire, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, and I do not care. Louis Bonaparte was, if I'm not mistaken, he was related to Napoleon Bonaparte, and I don't remember, he would have been Napoleon III, so he was grandson or something. Some relation, doesn't matter. The history is not that important to me at the moment. I knew it at one point. I stopped looking at it. I forgot. Here we are. But in that, Karl Marx is very clear that he says that the weight, he says men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. And I'm kind of paraphrasing from memory because I haven't memorized this particular set of passages. And he says that the weight of the existing world weighs like a nightmare on the minds of the living. In other words, your historical conditions trap you into a mindset, into a way of being, right? So that's being burdened by what has been, literally. And that the idea is that he says a few paragraphs down, he talks about how all the revolutionary movements in the past, so men make their own history through revolution and governance, but primarily revolution, moving history in lurches throughout time. And he says the revolutions of the past have looked to the past. But the revolutions of the 19th century, meaning the socialist and communist revolutions that he was trying to spark, actually do not look to the past. They don't romanticize the past. By the way, that's what the fascist movements did later in the 1920s and 1930s. They don't romanticize the past, they romanticize the future. He says they do not take their inspiration from the past, but from a future that can be. He doesn't actually say that can be, he says from the future. And so here you have the ability to envision something that can be, unburdened by what has been, and you can work to make that history come true. So the beating heart of Marxism, I think, is almost perfectly expressed in a couple of paragraphs on the first couple of pages of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx, which he wrote in 1852 or 1853, I forget which one. Okay, so that's the religion of Marxism. And Kamala Harris has it dumbed down for us, as you might expect, that we are able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. You find the same sentiment stretching across the Communist Manifesto. It's a little harder to find. Those of you looking, if you want to go look, the first paragraph of the Communist Manifesto, which we're about to talk about, then the last paragraph of the full actual body of the Communist Manifesto, which is not the last paragraph of the document, because there's a bunch of appendices where Marx complains about people he doesn't like. So there are 3 chapters, if I remember right, that are the bulk or the body of the Communist Manifesto. And if you read the first paragraph of chapter 1 and the last paragraph of what I think is chapter 3, the last paragraph of the body of the Communist Manifesto, then you will find the same sentiment expressed across the entire manifesto. But again, not exactly. Marx never said it the way that Kamala says it. Don't believe the memes on the internet. That's silly. So what is this communist religion about? Well, let's talk about the Communist Manifesto. How does communism work? What is communism in the words of its creators? The Communist Manifesto, for historical purposes, was published in 1848. And we don't have to remember the dates here, but I'm just kind of giving you timeline. 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, early 1850s, Communist Manifesto, 1848. And so the very first paragraph of the first chapter, there's a preface that's, quite famous about there's a specter haunting Europe or something like specter of communism's haunting Europe or something like this. We skip that and we go to the first chapter, which is bourgeois and proletarians, or bourgeoisie and proletarians, where he's defining the terms. And his case is that what's going on, this is the communist belief system, is that all of history, first of all, is made by men, but is the history of class conflict. So in every historical epoch, there are classes, and the classes war with one another. They are in intrinsic antagonistic conflict over social standing and access to resources. And he says that that can be summarized in a variety, it takes a variety of forms. It can be summarized in a single word, which is 3 words, oppressor versus oppressed. And that is the key structure of the Communist Manifesto, the key concept. Oppressor versus oppressed. History moves through the intrinsic conflict of an oppressor class and an oppressed class that are working together, whether they know it or not, to generate history in a dynamic called oppression. Now, Karl Marx does not fully believe that that's the only state of mankind, or the state of man's experience in life. He has this whole concept, what he calls the scientific socialism, wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus, as best I can do the German, which you can correct me, I don't care. His science of history, in other words, the movement of history, has a beginning state and an end state that are outside of history. History is the history of class conflict, and it begins with slavery. When one group decides to oppress another in slavery, now you have history being made. And not just being made, but moving. And not just moving, but moving by men's hands. And not just moving by men's hands, but moving by men's hands through the act of creating a dynamic of oppression and thus class conflict. Before history, there was a state he called primitive communism, where you have tribes, and tribes are extended families, and the extended family tribes do not have a sense of private property. Private property is the bugbear in this story. Okay? It's what makes men see themselves as estranged from one another. And what it all comes down to is the idea of the private of private property. What makes private property private is what's called in law the fundamental right to exclude. In other words, notice that, by the way, their thing that they push in answer to everything is inclusion, right? The fundamental right to exclude, which means if this is my knife, I can prevent you from having it. I can exclude you from taking it, from owning it, from holding it, from using it at my discretion. I have the fundamental right to exclude your use or holding or taking or ownership of the knife because it's mine. And that is the fundamental fall of man, actually, in the religion of Marxism. Before that, he says, in primitive communism, there's no such concept. Everything is owned communally within the entire tribe. The problem is that in this kind of state of nature, men are in tribes. Yes, they are communes. Yes, they share, which I don't even think is fully accurate, by the way. He's romanticized the past here. But they have no sense of private property. They do not have ownerships, but the problem is there's one here, and there's one there, and there's one over there, and they are estranged from one another. And in fact, when they meet each other, there's often conflict over territory or whatever else. And so the idea is that sooner or later, some of these tribes start to enslave one another, and they can do far more by creating slaves than they could do just as their own communal pod of maybe, anywhere between a few dozen up to maybe a few hundred that share everything. And so before history, we live in this kind of primitive, tribal, but communist state. And then way on the other end, after history, the goal is to return to a stateless, classless society that is now global communism, which means, if you've heard me talk about the logic of the spiral in the past, that you start at communism and you go through a variety of other states. Imagine you're walking, though, in a circle because you're going to come back to communism. Start with tribal communism, end in global communism. So it's like you walk in a circle that ends back in the same place, except not. It's like climbing a spiral staircase because you end back in communism, but elevated by one or more levels. It could be national communism as one level and global communism as a second, but you've elevated to a higher level. It's no longer that you have tribal communism in small, isolated tribes. You now have global communism. Same concept, higher level understanding. That is core to their theory of transformation, is that you're always trying to get back to the undifferentiated original at a higher level of comprehension, understanding, and practice. That's fundamental to this religion and its practice. But let's go back to the theory of history. First, you start out with tribes that are estranged from one another, and then they figure out that they can enslave. When they meet each other, they don't just fight over territory. They actually conquer the other tribe, take their territory, take their resources, and put the defeated tribe to work for them, and gather other defeated peoples and have them make babies and create an army of laborers who do slave labor to the benefit of the oppressing group. And now you have, for Karl Marx, the beginning of history, because history is defined by the movement of class antagonism. Before that, you don't have classes. You just have a bunch of estranged communists. After that, you have classes. So this is like we're walking around that spiral staircase, and we're no longer at communism. We're walking away from communism. We're walking around. We've introduced the idea of property. Maybe it's not wholly private. Maybe it's kind of more socialistic. In fact, maybe the ruling group owns everything and the exploited, enslaved groups own nothing. But then as you move through history, eventually the slaves revolt. The contradictions of the conditions become too much. They revolt. They're able to get a foothold. They band together. Something happens. They're able to band together. And there's a revolution in economic structure and social structure that creates what he calls a feudal economy. A feudal economy comes next. This is where, rather than having the pure antagonism of slavery, you now have this slightly symbiotic slavery through the lord with his serf, or the guildmaster with his journeyman, or something like this. So now you have some kind of a lord serf or master pleb relationship. So the idea with the king being a kingdom and being the kind of ultimate expression of that. So the lord is in charge of some land. In other words, he's a landlord. And so he is now the oppressor class. The king is the ultimate landlord of a nation. And so he is the oppressor class. And everybody else are his vassals or his serfs or his subjects or his servants in one way or another. And so the lord's serfs do all of the farm work and they do all of the things, and they make sure that the lord has a nice life, and in return the lord organizes the people that are under him, as well as concentrates economic utility to provide for the common defense primarily, and for some social order within that pod, that lordship or whatever. Okay, so then the feudal economy, people start to realize that this is a raw deal, and the landlords in this sense are not completely fair, and that why the hell can't I strike out on my own, especially if I have the capacity to defend myself and make for myself and make for my own, and I can trade freely with other people, and I don't need a set of elites in the royalty to determine how all that trade is going to be organized, and we shift out from the feudal system and into a capitalist system. Now, I'm saying shift, but just like the capture of all the slaves that initiates slavery and the slave revolt that initiates feudalism, this is a violent process. And in fact, the violent process is always revolutionary to Karl Marx. So that each of these stages, each of these steps around the circle is marked by revolutionary violence, in which the lower class bands together, violently ruptures with the higher class, and then moves along the spiral. So capitalism no longer uses the lord serf, or in kind of an indentured servitude model. It now uses wage slavery. The capitalists own all of the means of production, particularly the land, and particularly the heavy capital, the factories, for example. They might own the banks, and they certainly, I reiterate, own the land, and they therefore extract work to build whatever they want out of workers who are paid in money, usually an unsatisfactory amount of money, for their labor in producing whatever it is that is supposed to be produced by that factory or that land holding or whatever it happens to be, so that the capitalist can extract profit off of the backs of the exploited worker. And they call this wage slavery. Now, here's where things go sideways in reality, but we're going to continue on Marx's Science of History. Marx believed that the intrinsic contradictions of capitalism would eventually cause another rupture. And there's a funny way you can look at right now and say that this is what Marx was talking about, but there's always the ability to resurrect that this is what Marx was talking about. But Marx was not talking about this. Marx was specifically talking about the buildup of monopoly capital to the point where it is so outrageous and so egregious that the workers have no choice but to band together and revolt internationally to overthrow the capitalist structure and seize the means of production through violent revolution and enter into a worker as government owned situation. When the government owns everything, that's called socialism. And the workers would then be the legitimate government who would then own everything, having expropriated the expropriators, as Marx put it. In other words, his argument was that the capitalist, the big capitalist players expropriated people, artisans in particular, and small farmers from their small enterprises under feudalism, and conglomerated things into massive factories and made them work as wage slaves in bad conditions. And then now the workers turn on the capitalists and expropriate them. In other words, throw them out of power. And he says that this is going to be a violent revolution, and it's going to, however, be much faster and in some ways less brutal than the long protracted cruelty of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So the reason it's supposed, I said it might look like today, is because monopoly capital is supposed to start to look eventually like A, large multinational corporations, and then B, with very centralized ownership and control, I should say, and B, that in fact there's supposed to be a divorce of the commodity that's being produced from the capital entirely. In other words, the big financial markets go off and are doing their own thing, completely divorced from what's actually happening within production. And there's a reason to believe that that's kind of happened, but here's how history went sideways before we come back to socialism and complete the loop. History went sideways because what happened in truth was, and this is a little dipping into the historical context that we need, what happened in truth was that the workers actually wanted reforms. They wanted reasonable working hours, reasonably safe working conditions so that they're not risking life and limb, reasonably good or decent pay to be able to do this work. And they wanted, a reasonable working week, the 40-hour week that we now enjoy versus, 12-hour days or something like that, 6 or 7 days a week. And they wanted to have a work-life balance. In other words, they wanted labor reforms. And when they got them, what history has proved and what the critical Marxists later complained about is that they became conservative. They had stable, happy lives that they were proud of, and they didn't want a revolution anymore. They wanted reforms. Just like we see today then, we would also need reforms to our financial market to avoid financial cartels and monopolies, and we need reformation to our multinational corporate structure to prevent multinational monopolistic conglomerates. In a sense. But those things you could actually create a more fair economic system that would not look so much like the excesses of capitalism. Now, why is this Marx being wrong? Isn't Marx right? No, Marx is not right, because Marx called this capitalism. And I mean, I guess he's right about capitalism, but capitalism is not a true articulation of a market economy, which is actually what he's conflating. As capitalism, the belief that capital accumulation on its own is always a highest good, which is a strawman religion that Marx is criticizing, that produces, as you hear, monopoly capitalism. We saw that at the end of the 19th century. We see it again now, and we see similar problems, frankly, in both situations that Marx thought would lead to this rupture. What it actually leads to is the demand for reforms. Now, the communists would come out and say, hold on, that is actually just capitalism retrenching itself. That's interest convergence. It's keeping itself alive by giving away a little bit of socialism. But that's actually not what's going on. People just want reforms. And what they actually want is a relatively free market. They want a market economy in which they can participate. Now, Marx calls this, he talks about it under his theory of primitive accumulation, and he says under capital accumulation, this all goes away. So there's Marxist theory to deal with all of this, but it doesn't it's not right. He's not correct in how he's talking about these things, and he's been pretty thoroughly debunked about this, even though the point that he raises in the short term is actually kind of correct. Yes, there is primitive accumulation where you use your stuff to generate more stuff. Then there's capital accumulation where you use capital and get other people to build your stuff for you. But that's exactly how we build to the actual good life. We actually need structures by which we are able to build an economy that can produce things that genuinely raise the standard of living. And this is a point that Marx actually understood himself, because he had this entire internal battle about crude communism, which was the hatred of private property, and capitalism, and then versus his own version of communism, which I call transcendent communism, which actually requires a qualitative change in who you are to treat the entire world like it's your family, and hence like the tribal families at the beginning, to truly see yourself as a socialist, as a species being, a being that lives for the entire species, so that you can live out, as he put in the critique of the Goethe program, you can live out that from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, which, by the way, is bad economic theory. So why is Marx wrong about that? Because what we want is a market economy. We want the ability to be competitive. We want corporations that can amass sufficient resources to be able to produce marvels like iPhones and the microphone, and to produce them with economies of scale and with technologies that make them affordable and accessible to people. We want that. That's a good life. That's a high standard of living. We want that. But we also want these corporations to remain competitive. So there's this inherent tension. I guess the Marxists would call it a contradiction. But that's a manageable and necessary tension, because what happens is, in practice, when corporations get big enough in terms of their market share, it is no longer beneficial for them to do research and development and expensive things to innovate and move forward. It is more expensive, or more economical, I should say less expensive for them per unit, to try to box competitors out of the market. And so that monopolization threshold is actually the question. And below that, if we find a way to manage corporations, like antitrust laws were pretty successful 100 years ago, something like that could work again. But we have to figure out how to apply them to multinational conglomerates. But keeping competition on the table, while enabling the production of scale, and thus the enrichment of the people taking the risk in managing these things as a reward for shouldering that burden, is actually the tension in which we want to work in order to try to create a productive economy that actually can benefit the most people the most successfully. But Marx doesn't believe that. Marx believes it will intrinsically always go. There's no management system possible. Capital will always go to this disembodied form and this completely exploitative process, and then the workers will band together and revolt, which it turns out they don't. They want reforms, and they usually are not very easy to organize, as the cultural Marxists were struggling with. So anyway, the point, all that said, is that this is supposed to revolt into socialism, where in practice what's supposed to happen is that the corporations become extremely large and very few in number. They are in fact already run as totalitarian socialist production models, with the CEOs being the little dictators of each corporation. But there's only so many of them. In fact, there are probably very few at the latest stages of capitalism. And what you do, or what Marx says happens, is through this organization and revolt, the workers seize the means of production, keep the corporation more or less effectively intact, but now it's distributed ownership across the entire workforce, which is actually the entire workers' movement. So therefore, the workers in this megacorp and the workers in that megacorp are on the same team, and they share ownership between them, even in corporations that they don't work for. So you end up with this communal ownership, like I said, or social ownership through the state, where the state has erected itself in place of the capitalist production model. And Marx's vision here is that you don't land in crude communism that way, which is, you can have a commune, but it's kind of a mud hut situation where everybody's doing backbreaking work to get minimal reward, because they're trying to avoid private property, and there's all these problems that come up. And in this way, you can take all the benefits that you get from a fully fledged capitalist economy, and you just socialize the means of production and socialize the fruits. The problem is of course that it doesn't work. But that's the vision. And so that socialism, because it's now run by awakened people who understand social production as opposed to private property, is no longer, in the words of Vladimir Lenin, who ran the Soviet Union first, who established and ran the Soviet Union for its first, 9 years. Vladimir Lenin called this a semi-state. It's a state in that it acts like a state, which means that it oppresses its class enemies, which would be the bourgeois people at this point, the former upper class, producing class. It oppresses its class enemies because that's what the state is for in Marxist theory, is to oppress your class enemies. They're very explicit about that. But it's not, because a state is a full-fledged, full-blooded state is supposed to exist for this expressed and specific purpose of maintaining the existing class structure. But the socialists have the correct class structure, and they have no need to maintain it. Once the expropriators are truly expropriated, in other words, once the former ruling class, once the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, are thoroughly destroyed by their dictator government, the dictatorship of the proletariat that it's called, once it's thoroughly smashed and destroyed, at that point, there will be no more state, because there's no more need for a state, because there's no class enemy, because everybody's in the same class, everybody's socialist, and everybody has the same idea about how society is supposed to work, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, and they can maintain their high level of production standards, at which point the state, as Marx put it, withers away of its own accord. And when it withers away, what you're left with is a stateless, classless society that operates at the same high level of production as under capitalism, but with maximum leisure time, minimum requirement to work. I was going to say maximum freedom from the requirement to work. And like I said, no state, nothing has to govern it, because everybody's on the same page. And the reason it's supposed to work is because, like I said before, everybody's one big happy family. And so, like I said, that, whether you want to take it, let's do it properly. Let's do it with nations, because that's how it's always going to be. Although the goal is global, the idea would be that you start in primitive communism and you walk this path, this circle in a nation. Imagine it's like a circular staircase, and you go up one floor. And at the top of that floor, you're now at a national, you have communism in a single nation, like Soviet Union, or like the People's Republic of China, or North Korea, or Cuba. And then the idea is that that's supposed to spread to other countries. One by one, you use the existing consolidated socialist state to leverage other states into socialism, to spark revolutions there, to take them into socialism. And that's like walking them through another round up the stairs until you finally get global communism. So now you have, whether it's one turn of the screw or two, it doesn't matter. You start in communism, you walk through the history of productive forces, and you return to communism, at which point history ends. And that's an extraordinarily important concept, because that is an eschatological concept. Eschatology is a theory of the end of the world, or end times in religions. And so Marxism is an eschatological faith. If you actually want a really good read on this, Murray Rothbard, the famous paleo-libertarian, wrote a very good long essay, 50 some odd pages, about how communism is an eschatological religion. And I recommend you go look it up. It's not hard to find, and read it. It is sparkling in its clarity that Marxism is an eschatological faith. Communism is its heaven, and its mechanism, its practice, its liturgy as a faith is the conflict theory of historical movement. In other words, that it seeks to obtain ultimate peace through generating and driving conflict between classes. Communism is its kingdom of God built on earth. It's heaven. And again, the way that works is stateless, classless, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And it sees the difficulty in making this as a spiritual problem in people that has to be overcome.
it has this right idea, right, that we're going to distribute stuff, but people don't want to do that. People aren't motivated to work for other people's benefit, and especially when the work is bad or grueling, not too much anyway. They want something of their own, and it's not adequate. So what they see that is a spiritual failing in the people that need to be overcome. So what this should really be described as, though, frankly, and I think bluntly, is that the communists believe that we were, through the creation of private property, there is no God, right? We ejected ourselves from Eden in our small tribes, which were still at a very low level, but we could get back into Eden at a very high level on our own terms by building it here for ourselves. And in defiance of God, we enter back into Eden, which is called communism. So let's turn our attention to Marx's economic philosophic manuscripts from 1844. This is 4 years before the Communist Manifesto. Actually, one more point about the Communist Manifesto. The second chapter is actually about how it's all supposed to work. And the point that he drills down is, what is communism? He says that communism can be understood in a single sentence, which isn't technically a sentence the way he wrote it, unless my translation's bad and from the German. It is abolish private property. It actually says abolition of private property, which is not a sentence, but abolish private property as a command is. And so the goal of Marxism is to unmake the fall of man to return to Eden, which is communism. And you do that by abolishing the concept of private property. I don't have to get into the details of how he's got some cockamamie scheme where you get rid of private property and you replace it by, which has the fundamental right to exclude, and you replace it with individual property, which is the stuff that you're using. It's effectively the same as private property, except there's no fundamental right to exclude. Everybody's included all the time. You can't exclude people from use of your private property in this. And so if somebody else decides they want to use your stuff, you have no grounds upon which to say no, because it's not yours. It is ours and always was ours, and everybody's supposed to share like a big giant family. Or his actual comparison that he gives in the Economic Philosophic manuscript is like a marriage. The way that a marriage transforms two people into one person, communism is supposed to transform the population of the world into one person. That in the same way that a marriage is two people made one flesh. And that's the idea. So in Economic Philosophic manuscripts, that title, by the way, is 3 titles. That, not official titles. Marx didn't name this. This was given 3 names. And so one of them is the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts, or EPM, as it's often called. That tells you what it's about. And then it's the 1844 manuscripts. That tells you when it was published, 4 years before the Communist Manifesto. And then it's also called the Paris manuscripts, which tells you where it was written, which is in Paris. But the point, I'm only going to draw one point out of the EPM, out of the Economic Philosophic manuscript, which is that Marx delineates between crude communism, which is low-level and junky. It's a forced commune and everybody lives in a shithole country, versus what he calls transcendent communism, which clearly makes it a religion. And so he specifically says that the goal of communism is not crude communism. It is not merely to hate private property. It is not merely to seize the means of production or whatever else. It is, in fact, he says, when you do that, these people don't eat. These are people that do that are so low level, they don't even have anything to share amongst everybody. So they don't even know what it means to be a communist. And so he shuns crude communism, but that means you have to take capitalists into the socialist environment, into the communist environment from there. And that, he says, requires you to transcend private property, which is explicitly a religious concept. He says that communism is the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and thus a return of mankind to his true social, which is to say his true human nature. So mankind's true nature is, being human means being a socialist. And Communism as a transcendence of private property, in other words, leaving the private part behind, like I just explained, or turning around that spiral and elevating a level where you had private property and now you can't exclude people from it because it's shared ownership, it's commonwealth property. That transcendence that makes us all treat each other across the entire species as one happy family that shares everything that we have like a family would. That is how he defines communism properly. And it is down to a true qualitative change in who you are. Karl Marx is very clear that he talks about somebody who's truly awakened to their social nature. In other words, they've awakened at the gnosis of being. This is a Gnostic faith. I've talked about that in the past. I'm not going to belabor it here. The gnosis of being is that we're socialist. Our true being that we've been alienated from by the external power is socialist. That's a Gnostic sentence, okay? And that's the core sentence of Marxism. And when you awaken to who you really are as a socialist, it's like having new organs, new eyes, new ears, new sense, new skin, new everything, new taste. And he compares it to being able to tell the difference between pleasant sounds and beautiful music. When your ear is transformed because you learn to understand the higher culture of great music, you hear the music differently and you hear everything differently. And he says it's like that. It's like awakening to a true social nature. And in fact, you now have a human eye, a human ear, which perceives your true human, which is to say social nature and everything. So you have not just a new set of organs by which you perceive the world, or in other words, a new worldview. You also have a new perception of the world itself, that the world itself was meant for and made for humans, to be made by humans to be more fit for human use. And when we say humans every time, we mean humans as a collective across the universal experience of humanity. And so the goal of Marxism is, in this transcendent sense, is to transcend the fall of man as the introduction of private property and the fundamental right to exclude others from private property. In other words, to make slaves, as they would phrase it in Marxism, whatever kind you want to call it, whether it's actual slaves, whether it's bonded servants, or whether it's wage slaves, as they phrase this. The goal is to transcend all of the basis of that, which is private property, in order to return to our true human nature as socialists, to realize who we really were all along until private property came like an evil spirit and deluded us as like sin into a fallen, competitive state trapped in the walls of history. We're not in the primitive Eden, and we can't get to the future Eden or to heaven. We can't escape the material bondage of our lives until we all wake up and realize that we were actually socialists to begin with, and have been estranged by that, by the siren's call or the demiurgic lure of private property and the ability to exclude other people, and thus, by the way, the ability to see one another as individuals. Individualism is at the bottom of Marx's problem with capitalism. Individualism is at the bottom of his problem with private property ownership. The fundamental right to exclude means if this is mine and that is yours, then there's a difference between you and me. We are not part of the same program. We each have our own interests, we each have our own lives, and we are living for ourselves and not for one another, which of course grifters would exploit, which is why we can't live that way in part. Okay, so the goal of Marxism then is to, as a religion, is to undo the fall. The fall is the introduction of the fundamental right to exclude, or in other words, private property, and the ability to see ourselves as individuals separate from one another. And thus, if we do that, we are allowed to return to Eden on our own terms in open defiance of God, which they conveniently deny in order to be able to do that. So that's Marxism. So what's the historical context? I already gave you some hint about this, but the short version is it didn't work anywhere. From 1848, when Marx published Communist Manifesto, through 1867, when he published the first volume of Capital, through, frankly, 1917, when Lenin led the revolution in Russia, Communism didn't take off anywhere. Marx had an evangelistic model for communism. His model was go among the workers. And what were you supposed to do when you went among the workers? Agitate. You were supposed to convince the workers of their class consciousness. You were supposed to agitate them to believe that they were being exploited and that if they were to band together as a single unit, they could overthrow their bosses and take control and share ownership of everything. No way that some weird communist grifter is going to rise to the top of that pile and actually take control. No way that would happen. Duh. But that was the idea. Go among the workers and agitate them about their conditions. So he went around and sowed discontent. Why would he do that, by the way? Well, A, because it works. It's divide and conquer. But B, most importantly, if you want a revolution, you better get some angry revolutionaries, destabilized revolutionaries. But B, he would do that not just because it's a conflict-driven theory of history, like we already said, of class antagonism, but because the model is actually based on suffering, that what brings you to your social consciousness is actually suffering. And the reason Marx is so antagonistic to religions that aren't communism, which is why he starts with the criticism of religion, and he starts with atheism, and he starts with religion is the opiate of the masses, which he wrote in 1843, even earlier than the EPM. Because of that, religion hides your suffering from you. It makes your suffering bearable. It allows you to forbear a difficult world, even though it's difficult. In other words, if we look at it from the perspective of Genesis, we've been cast out of the garden and out of bliss, and we have to suffer in the world. And religion is what fills in so that we don't mind our suffering and don't overthrow the masters who are making us suffer. Now, Marx rejects the existence of God as a materialist, so we're not trying to overthrow God, although he actually explicitly said that's exactly what he's trying to do. TBH, to be completely honest, that's exactly what he's trying to do. The goal now is to overthrow. It's now a social program. The gods are the upper ruling classes of society, and you're going to overthrow them to take over. But you awaken to your consciousness of who you really are, which is a socialist, through suffering the exploitation of not living under socialism. So the upper class cannot possibly gain the awareness without maybe lots of listening sessions, as they call them today. They cannot possibly gain the awareness of why there needs to be this fundamental revolt. Now, look at your DEI training, by the way. You understand what DEI training is in the communist sense. The goal is to agitate among the workers, and then among the people who are in the upper class, whether it's white people for race Marxism, whether it's straight people for queer Marxism, whatever you want, it is to awaken in them a consciousness of their oppressor status. Why? Because when the only way you can awaken to an anti-racist consciousness, we're truly anti-racist, or a queer consciousness, we're all truly queer, but we've been alienated by a sense of normalcy. We've been alienated by racism from our anti-racist nature. We've been alienated from socialism by our private property owning circumstances. The only way you can get people to understand that is through inducing suffering as a result of that dynamic. And so he needs suffering. So why would you go among the workers and agitate them? Because maybe their lives are hard, but they need to suffer because of their lives being hard. There is no forbearance. There is no, this is the way it is. There is no, let's try to work for some reforms. There is, we need to understand our suffering and revolt against that which is causing it. And the model for the revolt is literally that if we look at Genesis, it is to be a revolt against the God that threw us out of the garden. And so when I say it's a return to Eden in man's own terms, on man's own terms, in open defiance of God, that's what I mean. But since they're Gnostics, in this case social Gnostics, what they believe is that the God from Genesis is an illegitimate deity. He is actually a prison warden keeping man locked in. And so what you're supposed to do is rise up like Satan or Lucifer and strike down this false god and establish yourself as who you really are, which is your own God ruling over your own kingdom. But that kingdom is worldly, and therefore it's a collectivist kingdom of all people. So anyway, the point is Marx's model his evangelism model didn't work for this religion. It did not spur, I should say. I've gotten in the habit of sitting around people who use that word wrongly too often. It did not spur a movement of workers that could organize, or especially self-organize, and take over, not, even a region, much less a nation, much less the world. Workers of the World Unite wasn't going to get anywhere, as it turned out, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, as you started to have massive conflict in Europe breaking out. Not that that ever went away, but as the First World War, the Great War, loomed, you had a major problem. You had people diving into national identities, whether they were workers or not, and they were much more concerned about being German or Italian or Russian or British or American than they were about being workers or socialists. They were much more concerned with other identities that were much more close to home and meaningful. And so two solutions to this problem arose through the time of the Great War, World War I. One was Vladimir Lenin's solution in so-called Eastern Marxism, which was the vanguard model, which is a shepherd model. Lenin believed that only the best theoreticians can actually lead. The proles are too stupid to do it for themselves, so only the best theoreticians can shepherd people through. They become a vanguard of the revolution, and they're going to become a vanguard government that will shepherd people into communism. They will force the people to go in, and through what Marx called the inversion of praxis, or socialization, people would be socialized by that dictatorship under their power. The vanguard party becomes the Bolsheviks in Russia. The vanguard party becomes the Communist Party, the ruling party, and they will then force socialization into socialism for the entire population. This vanguard shepherding model is being recreated in the West now under the brand name of stakeholder capitalism, which has created a ESG, environmental social governance scoring, Soviet mechanism. Soviet means ruling council or governing council. We refer to the workers' councils. Now we have expert councils, but it's the same thing. So Lenin's vanguard model, ironically, one of the banks is called Vanguard, as a matter of fact, that's running this scam, is called stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder Soviet. And I've talked about that in a different podcast. But the idea is that some enlightened experts are going to have to usher all the idiots through it because they won't self-organize and they don't understand it well enough. And it's going to be the top theoreticians who understand the big picture of what we're doing and why. In other words, what the communists want better than anybody else who's going to run it. And that actually worked at taking over the feudal society, and I stress that, feudal society, not capitalist society, of Tsarist Russia. And so Lenin was successful in implementing effectively a gigantic world power crude communist state, but he was, even in his attempts to industrialize, and Stalin's further attempts to industrialize, he was never able to, as he would refer to it, unleash the productive forces adequately to create a first world nation. In fact, they were considered second world nations in the first, second, third world model of classifying nations. And so Lenin's vanguard model was one solution to the fact that the workers wouldn't organize, but in the West that didn't happen, and part of it is because they didn't have the capacity to roll capitalists over the way that they were able to roll feudalists over. Lenin was able, through brutal methods that we are all aware of and military power that we can speculate upon, but he was also able to go around and get huge peasant and worker support by promising bread and land. You don't have bread, you don't have land, I can make sure you have both. Of course, those were lies. Everybody starved and everybody lost all their land to the state. And it turns out that state ownership and common ownership are not the same thing. And it was a catastrophe. But you couldn't pull that on capitalist countries. Britain wasn't getting fooled into bread and land. Most people had bread and land. We don't need you. Certainly America wasn't going to fall for that. Germany wasn't going to fall for that. They had to end up being forced. The Eastern Bloc got forced into communism by Soviet power after the Soviet Union was established through Lenin's ironically named anti-imperialism campaign that was meant to spread the Soviet Union to the entire globe. Now, the Western model, therefore, had to be different, and that's where cultural Marxism comes in. I know that I took a lot longer to introduce this. I don't even want to look and see how much longer I intended, like 25 minutes. Oh my God, an hour. Welcome to James Lindsay. Here we are. So this is where the Western cultural model comes in. And this is how we, down the line, we don't get to stakeholder capitalism, we get to woke. Okay, but you'll notice that here we have stakeholder capitalism using woke. So the Western model and the Eastern model have come back together. The S in ESG, the social in ESG, environmental social governance, The G is Sovietism. The E is obviously the climate change environmental stuff and net zero and absolute zero and degrowth. But the S is social justice or woke. And so cultural Marxism is going to get plugged back into this roughly a century later. But what's happening here during the World War I period, and I'm saying period because I don't mean strictly during the war. I mean, roughly the decade in which that war occurred. Early 1910s to the middle 1920s. Let's go with that, right? That's where cultural Marxism really takes off. This is, narrowly speaking, cultural Marxism is to be defined as Western Marxist thought from the 1910s to the 1930s. That's the narrow definition. This is the seeds of woke, okay? And like I said, we started with a historical note and a disclaimer, but this is a real historical thing that really occurred, however much they want to try to cover it up by alleging it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The narrow understanding of cultural Marxism, bearing the name cultural Marxism, was Western Marxism as it was practiced overwhelmingly in Europe from the 1910s through the 1930s. We can expand that to add in the critical Marxism of the Frankfurt School, which is actually heavily derived directly from this same movement, which extended roughly, we'll say, from the 1930s to the 1970s. And we can go even more broadly to include woke Marxism, which is still going on to present. So there's a very good reason why we can use the term cultural Marxism to describe everything from the beginnings of Western Marxism, although that's the better term, Western Marxism in the 1910s all the way through to the present day. But narrowly speaking, we're focusing on what was going on from the 1910s to the 1930s. And I'm going to have to do an appendix on this to briefly talk about the Fabian socialists, which were happening in Britain starting in the 1880s. So a little earlier. It's another socialist movement. It is explicitly non-revolutionary, so it is not Marxist. But we can't understand really how the cultural Marxist phenomenon has played out without understanding Fabian socialism, which is named for the Fabian Society or the Fabian Socialist Society, which, like I said, was inaugurated in Britain, in London, actually, I think, in 1884. So anyway, the target of cultural Marxism is the culture-producing institutions. So the idea was that, well, we can't get the workers to organize in these Western countries, Italy, Germany, France, Britain, I guess the United States. They won't organize. They won't unify. They're very interested in their national identities. Every time we try, we end up in fascism. Fascism keeps springing up when we take these socialist ideas and mix them with nationalist identity and actually anger and fear about Marxist provocation. And we end up with fascism every time. What the heck? Or we just end up with more capitalism, or we just end up with more, what am I looking for? Other identities rather than communist worker solidarity, like nationalist identities or even regional identities or something like that. And particularly among these, and I want to just say, by the way, fascism in some sense is like what happens when you inject the socialist mindset and this German idealist framework, and in fact French Romantic framework, into kind of a hyper crony capitalist situation where the state and the corporations, at least economically speaking, get married to one another. It has other aspects outside of the economic sphere that I'm not really going to go into. In fact, anti-Marxism is one of them. Rampant nationalism is one of them. Usually it's ethno-nationalism. But there are other characteristics. But economically speaking, it is where you basically, the state enables the rise of an oligarchy of monopolies, or an oligopoly is the fancy word for that. And they are de facto state entities, although they are owned by private interests who are allowed to become very rich off of them. And you say, well, that sounds like China. Yes, China has a new system called One Country, Two Systems. I talked about it in a recent podcast called 21st Century Communism or Communism 3.0, one or the other, both actually. Communism 3.0, I think, is the long one, where I talk about the Deng Xiaoping model, which has taken the basic spirit of communism as a theoretical political theory, and then it has incorporated the fascist model of corporate and state union as a practical business model. And that fusion becomes the model for the future, for 21st century communism or Communism 3.0. What we're dealing with, ESG reproduces that model in the West, but we're getting outside of what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about Antonio Gramsci right now, an Italian Marxist who is extraordinarily frustrated that the workers' parties of Italy would not band together in the 1910s, and when World War I broke out in 1914, that they threw caution to the wind and they became Italian more than anything, and Italian fascism under Benito Mussolini started to arise. In fact, in 1926, the Italian fascists threw Antonio Gramsci into prison, where he wrote the vast majority of, not that he wasn't prolific before, but when he went to prison, he was sent, on the words of the fascists, to stop his brain working for 20 years, and he spent 11 years in prison, dying in 1937, during which time he wrote by hand, in secret, hidden, over 3,000 pages of communist history that was immediately smuggled to Moscow somehow when he died in 1937 in that prison. But anyway, Antonio Gramsci has kind of a handful of ideas that kind of define what cultural Marxism is about. He's usually considered the father of cultural Marxism. I did a podcast about him a long time ago. It was very popular. I think it's one of the most popular ones I ever did. It was early in my days, so I apologize for any early thought, we'll call it, inaccuracy, I guess. But the biggest idea that Gramsci has is this concept of cultural hegemony. His analysis is that Western culture is very good at producing, in effect, a force field of cultural norms and values that works like it's just how it is. Like, be normal. That's how the queer theorists would see it. So the queering means defying cultural hegemony. As a matter of fact, diversity means diverse to cultural hegemony. So outside of cultural hegemony, that's why you can be a Marxist, or you could be like an angry indigenous Native American who's claiming their original beliefs, or you could be a Muslim or whatever you want that's going after. That's why the left is in love with all of these things, because they're all diverse to Western civilizational culture. So cultural hegemony is the problem, and Gramsci says that cultural hegemony is preventing people. It's producing a culture of capitalism that's preventing people from being willing to go socialist. They're not willing to risk it all in a revolution. They're not willing to dedicate themselves to this revolutionary idea. He knew Lenin. He wrote with Lenin, corresponded with Lenin, but he didn't agree with Lenin about everything. In particular, he also warned Lenin about Stalin and did not like Stalin one bit. But at any rate, Gramsci said that cultural hegemony is, in a capitalist country, is what actually has to be, I would say, overcome, but the right word is undercome, to turn a phrase, because the idea he came up with is actually cultural infiltration. You go to the where does culture come from? That's his question. And he says, well, institutions produce and promote culture, and he named 5 of them. The 5 culture producing and promoting institutions were family, religion, education, media, and law, with a special emphasis on education. Education was more important than the others, in his opinion. Family was the hardest. Media and law are actually downstream, and religion in some sense is actually even downstream from education. So family becomes this kind of weird one that's difficult, that you have to kind of get at from a different angle. And then the others can be captured through education. So education gets a very special prominence. But the idea was that what you're going to do is enter into these culture-producing institutions and establish what he called a counter-hegemony. In other words, you're going to bring Marxist understanding into these culture-producing institutions so that they, like a virus, right? So you go into the cell is no longer producing new, say, liver cells. It's now producing virus parts that are going to go out, and the cell dies, and those virus parts go out, assemble into viruses, and infect more cells. That was his idea. It's literally the model of a virus, whereas, Lenin had just taken over by force, in literally a military coup. And so this idea of counter-hegemony was that it later became called the Long March Through the Institutions, is that you would go into the institutions and create a new cultural set of values in the culture-producing institutions and let it emanate out to soften up the existing culture to a socialist turn, and then a socialist revolution could follow. That was his model. And like I said, the goal was to infiltrate the institutions of family, religion, education, media, and law, and transform them from within to soften up for socialism. His kind of his more famous remarks that's frequently misquoted on the internet. It adds a part Gramsci didn't say. The short part is true. The rest is not Gramsci. There's a very famous meme that's gone around attributing this whole thing to Gramsci. I don't remember how it goes because it's not true. But the true part says that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. So I want to draw your attention to the fact that he said it's a religion, and B, that it must overwhelm, which would be in my use undermine or undercome religion. Okay, religion, Christianity specifically, as a bulwark of Western values and a foundation of Western values. In the way that he saw that this was going to happen, it's a very important concept for our experience. Again, cultural Marxism is the seeds of woke that we're dealing with today, is through what are called organic intellectuals. So the idea was that where Lenin was using these highly trained theoreticians, ideally university-trained theoreticians, Gramsci was like, no, they're not the ideal educators. They're not the ideal intellectuals. What we need is workers. We need workers who have suffered. We need people not that studied this stuff in the ivory tower. We need people who have suffered in their lived experience. And so the concept of lived experience as a superior form of understanding and knowledge ultimately derives not in exact verbiage, but in concept from Gramsci and his need for organic intellectuals. So organic intellectuals were workers who were exposed to Marxist interpretations of the concepts, or of their experiences, I should say, to generate what we would now call lived experience of their suffering. In other words, a Marxist phenomenology of their circumstances as workers, as exploited workers, who would then become intellectuals and educators to create this counter-hegemony by going in among the culture-producing institutions. So they would organically be insinuated into the different institutions they were trying to infect, but they would carry with them the fact that their knowledge was street knowledge mixed with book interpretation. It wasn't book knowledge. It was street knowledge colored through Marxist theory. And for those of you who've paid attention to me for a long time and you know all about my Paulo Freire stuff, where he's talking about the process of conscientization and that everything has to be in a generative theme, so on, has to be relevant to the learner, it has to connect to his real life concrete experience. That's him channeling Gramsci's organic intellectual concept. But now everybody under Freire becomes an organic intellectual. We'll come back to Paulo Freire later. The second major cultural Marxist, and I'm going to talk less about cultural Marxism than you think, given that this is the basics of cultural Marxism, is a Hungarian Marxist by the name of George Lukács. Now, George is spelled in a way you probably aren't familiar with if you are not used to Hungarian spelling, which I'm certainly not, but it is, if you're looking him up, Gyorgy. Gy is pronounced a bit like a J in Hungarian, apparently, and if I'm wrong, I don't care. Then Lukács is spelled Lukacs, so you can look him up if you want to look him up. He's very famous for a book he published in 1923, probably his magnum opus, but he wrote a lot, and that book was called History and Class Consciousness. He had two major ideas worth touching upon in that book. One is the concept of social reification, which he develops primarily in the 4th chapter of the book. And the general idea of social reification is that which we are socialized into is real. We can make things real, or things are made real in our lives through social processes. And that, in fact, can be used to create an illusion, or it can be used to drive people toward the truth. So if Marxists try to socialize people into something, they are socially reifying Marxist theory. And if the capitalists are controlling things, they are socially reifying capitalist ideas and making people believe that they're just fundamental aspects of reality. So if you think that competition is a natural mode of production, and improvement and innovation, and that scarcity leads to the need for innovation and thus innovation, and that a profit motive enables people to benefit from taking the risk of stepping out of what is into something that might actually be innovative, then you have had those ideas reified or made real. You believe those are features of economic reality, when in fact they are merely social constructs. So the social construct on the critical theory side, which is not the postmodern side, comes down in this regard from George Lukács. He also has a concept that I think is much more important to pay attention to, which is the educability of consciousness. In other words, you learn class consciousness in stages. And those stages are kind of, in essence, and I do this better and worse sometimes, so I don't know what's about to come out of my mouth. First, you have to indicate to people that they are part of a class. They have to understand that they are workers, or that they are people of color, or whatever it happens to be, that they have a class identity. That's the first step. So you're going to, instead of just trying to go among the workers and agitate them and then tell them Marxist theory like Marx suggested, now we're going to educate them step by step into class. Hey, look, you're in a class. In other words, you have a group identity is step one. And then secondly, that class is oppressed. You are under oppression. You are getting a bad shake in life. So now that's the agitation part. Remember, I guess I didn't say it here, but I have in the Lenin podcasts. Lenin believed in what was he called agitation and propaganda, agitprop, and taking the agitation and propaganda, or agitprop, into every class in society. And he differed from Marx by saying that Marx only took it to the workers, and no, you have to take it to everybody. And that's why DEI doesn't just train the underclasses, so to speak. It trains everybody and induces lots of upper class guilt through agitation and propaganda. Well, here, the idea was that you were going to go in and teach these people that they are suffering as a result of being in an oppressed class. Hey, look, society is stratified into classes. There is an upper class, your betters, and then there's you. And they're cheating you. They're exploiting you. That's where the agitation part comes in. So we're not all the way to the agitation propaganda in all levels of society, but we're going to teach people class consciousness here, is what George Lukács is saying. So you teach them that they're part of a class. In other words, they have a group identity, and that's the most meaningful part about them. And that group is in fact oppressed, and that oppression is part of a dynamic, is the third step, and that dynamic is a dynamic of oppression. You cannot have oppression without an oppressor, and you cannot have an oppression without an oppressed. So the two classes become oppressor and oppressed, just like the first page of the Communist Manifesto, and that's an intrinsic dynamic. In fact, it is a class antagonism that drives the movement of history, hence this book being called History and Class Consciousness. And so you're going to awaken this sense in them, and then you have to convince them that solidarity is necessary, because in fact, because of this dynamic, because it's a dynamic, they are players in the game. The rules are not all made by the ruling class. As a matter of fact, they are players in the game. The history is moving through a dynamic of oppression. This is how you get to class consciousness, what it means to be who you are in your group class identity. That there's a dynamic of history that's moving everything, and you, whether you wanted to be or not, whether you like it or not, are a participant in that. But if you're a participant, that means you're on the game board. That means you can change something. But because you're oppressed and in a weakened position versus the ruling class, the only thing that you can do in order to fight the rulers is to band together. It's sort of like the logic of unions. You have to syndicate. You have to band together in order to incorporate people power versus managerial power. But in this case, it's underclass versus overclass. The underclass has to band together to overthrow the relatively small number of exploiters at the top. And then, only then, do you actually have successfully educated somebody into class consciousness, or they actually have class consciousness. So you're part of a class. That class is oppressed. Oppression is a part of a dynamic. That means it's a part of the movement of history, and you're a player on the board, and you have an obligation to band together in solidarity to overthrow it. And then you've awoken class consciousness. And the challenge in the end of chapter 3, where George Lukács talks about this, the challenge is that once you awaken that class consciousness, it doesn't tend to go away. So the last battle to be fought, think about how spiritual this sounds, is for the proletariat to destroy itself as a class, is to overcome itself and to seize the means of production and stop thinking of itself as a class in the same moment that it does. And that rarely happens, thus causing some of the dramatic abuses that were already by 1923 being witnessed in Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. So this is where all of a sudden this idea that we're going to awaken people into a consciousness deliberately and in steps. In other words, how are these organic intellectuals taking the institution of education and then infiltrating into the other institutions going to produce that counter-hegemony? Not by going among the workers, but by a structured educational program of teaching people to think in terms of corporate identity in an oppressor-oppressed dynamics. In other words, Marxist religion, and then to get them to believe that they are historical change makers in that dynamic by their very nature, or by the very nature, in fact, of the dynamic itself. They are part of the production of history, and thus they have to do this. And so the educability of class consciousness and a model for graduating it in stages and putting it into, say, schools or into workplace training is outlined for the first time by George Lukács in 1923. And so he's really, in a very operant sense, the father of cultural Marxism in practice, whereas Antonio Gramsci is more kind of the father of cultural Marxism in theory. And if you want to read the prison notebooks, I encourage you. I don't even have the full version. I have an abridged version. The full version was translated at Notre Dame in 1970 by a man with a funny last name, Joseph Buttigieg. He has a famous son named Secretary Peter Buttigieg, who is the Secretary of Transportation right now, in case you wonder about Marxist infiltration into our government. Red Diaper Baby Pete Buttigieg is 100% Joseph Buttigieg's son, who translated Antonio Gramsci into English for the first time at Notre Dame in 1970. Just fun fact. Gramsci, if you want to read the prison notebooks, I have an abridged version. It's like 700 pages, and it's so tedious and rambling. I can't even imagine what the 3,000-page version is like. Now, let me take a quick digression from that's cultural Marxism. Let me take a quick digression to a parallel model, which I mentioned, the Fabian Society in England. So the Fabian Society is most famously known not as the Fabian Society, although that's a very famous name. It is more famously known by a name that is not often attached directly to the Fabian Society, which is INGSOC, I-N-G-S-O-C. And if you are literary enough, you will recognize that that's the totalitarian government in 1984 by George Orwell, because George Orwell was pestered all the time by the Fabians to join, and he hated them, and he wouldn't. And so, since the Fabian Society was invented in 1884, or founded in 1884, he decided to imagine a century of Fabian growth in power until they had the power of Stalin, and wrote a book about that, a warning book about that called 1984. Isn't that interesting? And called the bad guy organization INGSOC, which is an abbreviation, spelled interestingly, for English Socialism, INGSOC. The Fabian Society is the arbiter of English socialism. And so you've heard of this concept. It is the idea of 1984, is if they get power. You can witness that in real time in its development, because the Fabian Society has famous members like Keir Starmer, who is the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and who has taken this country in a blatantly communist direction immediately. So what you need to understand about the Fabian Society is that they are communists, but they are not Marxists. And that's why they're a kind of an aside here. They're not Marxists because they are not revolutionary communists. They do not believe that there should be an explicit outward violent revolution. They believe that you should achieve your power through institutional infiltration over time and gradual changes. In other words, the boil the frog model. You turn up the temperature a little bit, you turn up the temperature a little bit, you turn up the frog never knows it's boiling. You go a little bit too far, back off. Let everything calm down. Go a little bit too far, back off. Heat up the world and remold it to the heart's desire. That's actually their model. It's actually on their famous stained glass window they produced, where they have heated the world to hot in a forge, and they're beating it on an anvil with hammers to reshape it as they would. Their crest is, I'm not kidding, their coat of arms is a wolf in sheep's clothing, which is above the anvil and earth on the window. They explicitly see themselves as wolves in sheep's clothing who will infiltrate institutions, and their favorite game is to create a mock democracy. Now, Lenin, who they did not really agree with on the revolution part, but agreed with on virtually everything else, Lenin famously said that the best way to control the opposition is to be the opposition ourselves. In other words, that you'd have a controlled opposition through infiltration of the opposing factions, and you make your own fake opposition, right? And so then it looks like you could very easily generate a sham democracy where there's a sham, let's say, red team and blue team that fight all the time, but somehow they all agree on the policies that increase socialist tyranny. Sounds like your world? That's the Fabian model right there. The Fabian model of institutional infiltration is to infiltrate both sides, create a sham democracy, and ram their policy up the middle. They fight where it doesn't matter, and they agree where it advances Fabian interests. Doesn't that sound like rhinos? Indeed, the rhinos were probably heavily inspired by Fabians and Fabian thought. The Fabians also were responsible for creating the infiltration of Protestant religion, Baptist faith in particular, in the United States, called the social gospel. That was generated by Walter Rauschenbusch in Hell's Kitchen, New York City, in 1905, I think, plus or minus 2 years. And Walter Rauschenbusch had spent the previous year and a half living with Sidney and Beatrice Webb of the Fabian Society Foundation, foundational members in the preceding year or so to writing the social gospel, which you can go read the social gospel and you'll see that it's like a very early Protestant spin on what later became liberation theology in the Catholic Church as a likely KGB infiltration into that organization in South America. So the Fabians believed in infiltration. They believed in infiltrating both sides, creating a false dialectical fight between the two sides that allows their agenda to go up the middle. They established, or helped establish, I should say, the Labour Party in UK and allegedly the Liberal Party in Canada. They are definitely behind, they established themselves the London School of Economics, which has among its graduates George Soros. Just to kind of paint a picture for you here of how influential they've been. The Fabian Society has been incredibly influential. It also sprang out of a weird religious cult called something like the Fellowship for New Life in the 1880s, which was an explicitly like hippie, socialist, theosophical, occult group that had remaking humanity at a spiritual level to be a social whole as part of its goals. So anyway, the Fabian Society is not that far off from its roots in that regard. But anyway, it's a parallel thing, and I bring it up under cultural Marxism because it also had the ambition, although it wasn't looking for a socialist revolution at any point. It wants to do institutional soft coups. Think of it like a cobra being Marxism, and it's going to strike you with its fangs and poison you, and you die, and then it can eat you and take over. Versus the Fabian Society operates more like a boa constrictor. It's going to wrap slowly around you and squeeze the life out of you when it's too late to do anything, and then you're dead and it can eat you. Same general idea, but there's no violent revolution. Their goal is to get members into governments in all factions, members into media in all factions, and so on and so forth. So they are like unto the cultural Marxists, but operating with a slightly different theory. Now we move on to Unit 3, Critical Marxism, or the critical theory, as you're more likely to have heard it called. And obviously critical race theory. If you just don't specify race, you end up with critical theory. So it's amazing how hard it was to convince people of that 5 years ago. That, in fact, was a heavy point of denial. But critical Marxism is a divergence from cultural Marxism. So a little historical context. Critical Marxism is the concept that comes out of the Frankfurt School, which was originally called the Institute for Marxism at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. It realized that name, Institute for Marxism, was a little bit too on the nose and rapidly changed its name in the early 1920s to the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. And so that's why it's called the Frankfurt School, is because it was at a university in Frankfurt. And it was a school of Marxism, hiding itself as a school of social research. The historical context was that cultural Marxism generally had some right ideas. These guys that founded it, including Karl Grunberg, Alex Veal, if I got that right, I might have Felix Veal. I always get this mixed up. Felix Veal, I think. Walter Benjamin and a handful of others. They were deliberately and directly working with Gramsci and with Lukács and sometimes with Lenin in formulating ideas in the 1910s and even going into the 1920s, although Lenin was a little disposed in Russia after 1917 and can only correspond, I believe, by letter, and their goal was to incorporate into this cultural Marxist movement in the West the sociology and psychology fields, particularly the sociology of Max Weber, that's Weber if you're not speaking German, and the psychology of Sigmund Freud, who is, of course, very famous. The target of the critical Marxist school is culture itself, meaning the culture of capitalism. It's no longer going after the culture-producing institutions specifically. It's going after the culture of capitalism, although it did become very interested in something called the culture industry later. In fact, the idea was that capitalism, through entities like marketing in particular, actually has an industry of producing culture, packaging up and commodifying culture, and then selling it to people. So when you're interested in having the real thing, Coca-Cola, which is a brand, you have been packaged up a commodity that's not just a soft drink and a unique bottle that was designed, but an entire brand image and a lifestyle that's sold with it through the marketing. And so a culture around people who drink Coca-Cola has been produced, manufactured, commodified, and sold to you, and you bought into it. And in fact, the culture of capitalism that is being promoted by the culture industry, you could extend that to all brands and the phenomenon of brands in and of itself. The culture of capitalism is designed to flatten you out as human beings. It is to make you believe that the good life is going to work, getting a good job, going to work every day, earning a reasonable living wage, something that you can have a modest, maybe lower or lower class or lower middle class or even middle class, particularly middle class lifestyle, maybe even upper middle class lifestyle. You can possibly get into that, and you can buy yourself nice stuff and define yourself in terms of the cultural icons that have been packaged and sold to you so that you're a part of that system. So maybe your dream becomes that you want to own a Corvette, so you buy into the Chevrolet branding and the image of Corvette, and you get into Corvette culture, and you buy it, you work hard, go to work every day rather than going and being a protester. You go to work every day, you suck it up, you work for the man, you make your money, you earn enough, you finally buy your Corvette, you think you're happy because you got what you want, you wash it on Saturdays, you cruise town with it, gas is cheap, everybody's happy, you're having a great time, and you, my dear fool, according to the critical Marxists, have been tricked. You have been seduced by a culture of capitalism that has you working as an unpaid employee for Chevrolet, driving around with their brand icon, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. So their goal was to target the culture of capitalism and the culture industry. But remember how Marxists work. Marxists seize the means of production. Karl Marx wanted to seize the factories and the farms. And that's what Lenin literally did. And that's what Mao literally did using Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century. The cultural Marxists wanted to seize the means of cultural production through the culture-producing institutions. So they wanted to seize family, education, religion, media, and law, and use those to produce new sets of socialist cultures. Well, the critical Marxists take a new turn into this. They come up with the idea that there's a culture-producing industry, so they're going to capture the culture-producing industry. Now, if you have ever heard my friend Jennifer Say, who runs XXXY Athletics, which is a cool brand if you're paying attention to the gender ideology issue that you can check out. Jennifer was a big corporate brand manager. She understands branding. She understands the power of branding, and she is very clear when she gives her public talks that the left has completely understood and controls the idea of branding, and they sell a leftist lifestyle through corporate branding. And that works really well in the ESG model, which requires them to market in particular ways, like rainbow flags all over your Corvette or whatever, right? And we all make fun of that because it's rainbow flags for every car manufacturer in the world except for their Middle East divisions whenever they put them on social media during Pride, right? So she understands the power of branding and says that they understood the power of branding, and that's them seizing the means of the culture-producing industries. They also become very interested in seizing the means of production of television, movie, radio, news media, and so on, magazines, print media, comic books. Are you starting to catch on? If they can figure out how culture is packaged up and sold and can seize the means of culture production, then they can produce a new culture. That was the primary goal underlying the Frankfurt School in practice, while in theory it was to take the ideas of the cultural Marxist turn in Western Marxism and to combine it with the sociology of Max Weber, for example, and the psychology of Sigmund Freud, for example. Although Erich Fromm was a psychologist, was a member of the Frankfurt School. They were very interested in, the ideas of Adler. They were interested in the ideas of Skinner with operant conditioning. They were willing to appropriate whatever they had to appropriate. Theodor Adorno, a member of the Frankfurt School, was the author of The Authoritarian Personality, where he identified right-wingness and authoritarianism as correlated traits. And in fact, part of what defines being authoritarian is being right-wing and vice versa, which is a massive psychological piece of propaganda. But that's also part of the culture industry, right? Because culture is also downstream from education. So if they could seize the educational models and the material that gets taught in schools, and they're also seizing that. Now, I say all that, and they were not horribly successful. They were actually very unsuccessful, because what they did in practice, frankly, was bitch all the time. And they didn't really produce a whole lot of value. They did get, especially by the 1960s, a fairly massive following, in particular, Herbert Marcuse, who we're going to spend a bit of time with in a second. But let me start by just mentioning that the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School of Critical Marxism, as we're going to call it, was founded by Karl Grünberg in Frankfurt, Germany in 1923. I'm not going to pay any attention to Karl Grünberg or his ideas at all right now. I'm going to mention briefly, just because of its slight uncomfortability, but importance to mention, that one of the early members who was probably most influential very early on was Walter Benjamin, which you would spell as an English-speaking person, Walter Benjamin, but it's not pronounced that way. And Benjamin was, in fact, not as interested in mixing in just sociology and psychology, but also his strange take on Jewish mysticism into Marxist theory. So that I stress the word mysticism here and not the word Jewish, which is not going to go well with the Groypers or whoever else in the woke right don't like that. But the fact is that that's what it was. It's these cockamamie and crackpot views on Kabbalah and so on that were popular among mystical circles and esoteric circles that he was trying to mix in symbolic form into Marxist theory. Should also add that the Frankfurt School was actually trying to reincorporate more Hegel back into Marxist theory, and part of their belief was that that Marx had gone too far away, and his anger and critiques of Hegel, he'd gone too far away from Hegel, and they try to pull it back to a little bit more of that idealism, which is very important, because my belief is that woke actually is a sublation of materialist Marxism and idealist Hegelian, or it's like a idealist materialist mixed form of Marxism, but I digress. The first character I want to talk about with critical theory or critical Marxism is the developer of critical theory, in a long essay about 80 pages, and I'm not sure if it says anything at all of worth at all, to be honest with you. I just reread it a little while ago, a couple months ago, and I'm like, what the hell is this about? It's called Traditional and Critical Theory. The author of that was Max Horkheimer, and he wrote that in 1937, and if I'm not mistaken, he was the acting director of the Frankfurt School at the time. Now, there's been an upheaval here that's very important historically to mention, which is that in 1933, the Institute for Social Research, as the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about cultural Marxism alleges, these guys were all of Jewish ethnicity. Hitler didn't care about whether you were a practicing Jew. He cared about your ethnicity because he was seeing it as a race. And so these dudes were not safe in Frankfurt following 1933 when Hitler took the chancellery. And so they fled, and they first went to Geneva, and then with the help of the Frankfurt School and Rockefeller money came to the United States. And in particular, they holed up in elite universities, first at Columbia University, which welcomed them warmly, and then later they spread out to places like Brandeis and Harvard, and not as much Harvard. Brandeis was big for Marcuse, the UCLA, UCSD, arguably some influence at Berkeley and Davis, but certainly UCSD, UCLA, Columbia, and Columbia being first, and then Brandeis University took these guys on. So Max Horkheimer by 1937 is in the United States. Now, he later went back to Germany after World War II ended, but Herbert Marcuse did not. Herbert Marcuse stayed in the United States. And the rest of the members, I'm not going to get into Adorno and his hatred of jazz and every other thing. So at any rate, we have Horkheimer develops the critical theory. The idea, he said, of the development of the critical theory is the most important thing to realize about it. This is why all they did was bitch, and they were minimally effective, because the definition of critical theory is always bitch. I mean, not exactly. Here's what he said, and I'm not quoting exactly. This is a not quote exactly podcast. What he said was that what he realized is a couple of things. First, for his development of the critical theory, first he realized Marx was wrong. Marx believed that capitalism would immiserate the worker, but in fact it does not immiserate the worker. It allows the worker to build a better life. That is a direct quote from an interview he gave in 1969 that I happen to have memorized. He then went on to say, in staring at this problem, in devising the critical theory, what he realized was that it's not possible to envision an ideal society on the terms of our present existing society. You can't even talk about what the Marxist socialist state should look like, is what he's saying. It's not even that we don't have a vocabulary. It's fundamentally impossible to talk about it in the existing terms. It's beyond vocabulary. There's no symbols, there's no art, there's nothing you could do to convey the ideal liberated world. He says, however, what we can do is complain about those aspects or criticize those aspects of the existing society that we wish to change. And that's the crucial thing. So it literally is the invocation of Marx's belief that the method boils down to the ruthless criticism of all that exists, which Marx derived, by the way, from Goethe, same Goethe University. You'd pronounce it, if you are not into the German, Goethe, Goethe. Goethe wrote the play Faust, and in Faust, the character Faust makes a deal with the devil. The devil's voice is named Mephistopheles, and he appears, and Mephistopheles at one point in the play says that all that exists deserves to perish, and Marx would run around quoting that, and the ruthless criticism of all that exists, because all that exists deserves to perish. So that was literally a satanic idea, and Marx knew it, and he incorporated it at the center of his theology that we call Marxism or communism today. Max Horkheimer channels that same vibe and says, well, it's simply impossible to envision a better world, to talk about a better world, to draw a better world, to describe a better world, to imagine even a better world, but we can ruthlessly criticize all that exists in the existing world that we wish to change. Now, of course, I've riffed with his language. He said it is possible to criticize that in the existing world that we wish to change, or something very close to that. So the critical theory is a theory of constant critique of everything that Marxists disagree with and want to change, which is, by the way, everything. At a very minimum, everything that's not giving them 120% of their way all the time. So that's where critical theory comes from. That's the point of critical theory. And it is meant to be a complete second dimension of thought that you have to wake up to, that you have to understand, and is not a traditional theory. Traditional theories are designed to understand and describe the world around you. Critical theories are designed to comprehend, to change the world around you. They are a theory of change. Critical theory is a theory of change, as a matter of fact, and it's change through criticism. In theological terms, this is an apophatic, I think I say that right, apophatic maybe, theology. It is a negative theology. You're going to bring about, and at least for Marcuse, when we get to him, you're going to bring about the utopia by carving away every bit of the existing society that's problematic. And when you get all the problematics, everything people don't like away, when you get rid of all of the things Marxists might critique, which PS was everything that exists, remember? When you've critiqued everything that exists satisfactorily, what is left will blossom into the ideal society, aka socialism. Actually existing liberated socialism, not the shit that they had, because the critical theorists understood this, not the shit that they had running in Soviet Union. They were very fond of what Mao was running in China, maybe partly in ignorance and maybe partly not. So that was Max Horkheimer, and his contribution is the development of the critical theory in 1937. And the goal was to criticize everything that exists. He wrote another book famously, I'm not going to talk about it in length, in the mid-40s, 44 and 47, 2 editions came out. He wrote that with Theodor Adorno, and that book was called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And basically his contention is that reason becomes unreason over time. It becomes its opposite. And so that a new rationality has to be born out of the dialectical conflict of rationality and irrationality, that science and rationality become their own mythologies. I think they have recognized this since and weaponized it against us, as a matter of fact. But at any rate, the dialectic of enlightenment was that the Enlightenment will be the Enlightenment's own undoing. And of course, I mentioned that briefly only to point out that the woke right have adopted this thesis, although in a different way, a traditionalist pointed direction. Although honestly, while Horkheimer and Adorno wanted a socialist utopia or socialist vision, a negative utopia is what Adorno referred to. He said it's not possible to cast an image of the utopia in the positive, so we can assume he had a negative utopian vision. That while they were looking forward like that these woke right guys are doing the same thing. They're looking forward, although they're just channeling their vision through a romanticization of the past. And if you read Dialectic of Enlightenment, it's hard to read because it's all about it's all written in terms of the Greek mythology. It's all written in terms of these kind of symbolic Greek mythological characters. And that brings us actually straight to Herbert Marcuse. So Herbert Marcuse, in the 1950s, so just after that, wrote a book called Eros and Civilization. Now, Herbert Marcuse is by far the most influential of the critical theorists, or of the critical Marxists, or of the Frankfurt School guys. I mean, some people might give Jürgen Habermas some high influence. He came after Marcuse. But Habermas is doing something mostly irrelevant, not totally irrelevant, but mostly irrelevant, because Marcuse's track becomes dominant in practice and dominant in the universities. And so critical theory becomes much less interesting as a pure academic pursuit after Marcuse. So in the Marcuse's, before I get into his details, Marcuse's big vision was to, he re-invoked utopianism. He very openly spoke of the utopia, the utopian possibility, which is, he said, has been regarded as an impossibility now. But in fact, it is possible. So he's actually invoking a utopian liberated state, a socialism that is liberated from all of the problems of capitalism, but is in fact also liberated from the bureaucratic states that you see and the abuses that you see in Soviet Union. And so his vision actually is very important because it becomes the impetus to fuse somehow the spirit of socialism and the practice of capitalism, which again, if you remember what I said a little bit ago, or if you listen to my Communism 3.0 podcast, that's exactly what they did in China, and starting in the 1970s and 80s, late 70s and 80s. And that's exactly the model for the world under ESG today in the West. But this utopian vision that he had is a big deal, because now we're back to this idea of entering Eden. And in his book in 1955, Eros and Civilization, he actually says that the way back into the Garden of Eden is to take a second bite from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what he's actually referring to is that the purpose or the need to escape the capitalist repression is to free the libidos. So I say that in the plural, not the libido, which we could say I think is grammatically correct, but the libidos, plural. What are the libidos that I'm talking about? Well, one of the libidos that you're going to have to free is the sexual libido. And so the whole sexual revolution in the 60s could honestly be tied, I mean, it's heavily rooted in feminism, let's not be mistaken, with which Herbert Marcuse worked, by the way, but is heavily theoretically presaged by this 1955 book, Eros and Civilization. You hear that in the title, Eros, right? Eros, like erotic, like the god Eros, right? And the whole thing is about how everything comes down to Eros versus Thanatos. So in other words, the erotic versus death, right? And so he says that the capitalist society actually forces us to squash our libido and transform that productive energy, our sexual libido, and transform that productive energy into productive work, like through the Protestant work ethic. So you're supposed to suppress your sexuality and express your sexual energy by being productive in the world. And he says, well, that's no way to live. We're going to liberate sexuality from that. But the other libidos are just to do whatever you want. It's kind of like a libido, a desire, a drive, a will to work less, be lazy, be frivolous, have fun, to party, but also to dominate, a libido dominandi, that the left should have the power to be able to dominate. And in fact, I don't know that he says that explicitly, but it's very clear that that's what's followed from his philosophy. And I've often said, and Eros and Civilization is perhaps not the best of the books to indicate this in most ways, but I've often said that that Herbert Marcuse is the creator of the world that we live in today. Or I say we live in Herbert Marcuse's world. And we'll talk about Repressive Tolerance, his essay from 65 here in a few minutes, an essay on liberation and one-dimensional man and their relevance, and also the counter-revolution revolt. Those are the books I'm going to talk about in addition to Eros and Civilization. And it's extremely important to realize that we live inside Herbert Marcuse's logic because he was the most influential leftist in the 1960s in the West. It's probable that Mao Zedong was more influential in the world as a leftist, or Stalin. I guess Stalin died in 1953, so he couldn't have been in the 1960s. I don't know that Khrushchev or his followers were that influential. Soviet Union was still a big deal in the 1960s, but Mao was clearly more influential as a leftist. But in the West, Herbert Marcuse is without equal. Hundreds of thousands of books sold in the 1960s. Huge audiences when he would speak, able to penetrate into speaking to racial minority groups that basically should not normally have allowed a crusty old white German dude to speak to him. Incredible rock star popularity, hard to overstate. Considered the father of the new left. And that new left is very important because that's why Jürgen Habermas is not that important to the story and what came out of Marcuse is, because the new left sort of takes over the picture as we go toward woke and away from strict critical theory. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So in 1964, he writes his most important book, which sold 300,000 copies allegedly in the first year. It's titled One-Dimensional Man. Remember earlier when I said that the logic of the culture of capitalism and the culture industry flatten you out, and I talked about Corvettes? That's a big part of what this book is about. There are a few things this book really talks about, and that's one of them, is that you become one-dimensional. Your entire life is actually defined in terms of your ability to participate in the capitalist machine. And so you lose your ability to see outside of the capitalist logic entirely. The capitalist, we'll call it rationality, because he uses that word in a different way a lot, and we're going to talk about that. So that is why the book is titled One-Dimensional Man. People are flattened down. Capitalists in an advanced capitalist economy that's succeeding are flattened down. And one of the things he complains about is, in fact, that just like Max Horkheimer said also in the 60s, is that, it's not true. Advanced capitalism, once you got worker reforms, did not, in fact, immiserate the worker. It allowed him to build a good life. He says, in fact, that it delivers the goods is actually a phrase that he uses. It delivers the goods. And he says, as a result, the working class becomes conservative. The working class becomes stabilized. Those are words that he uses for it, counter-revolutionary. And that's a problem. But he talks more about that in Essay on Liberation, so we'll come back to that. He also talks about how he's like trying to figure out why did the Soviet Union go sideways. And he says, in fact, that there's a technological rationality. And it turns out this is really important. This is really, really, really important in a kind of present, clear and present ways. So there's a technological rationality to the technology itself. So what Karl Marx actually says in Capital at one point is that the actual goal of communism is to seize the means of production of capitalism at its zenith, at its pinnacle. So you're going to take over all the big capitalist factories, all the heavy capital, all the machinery, all the things that produced a good life, and then run it in a socialist manner. That's the vision, right? Well, he says, no, that didn't work. He claims that that's what the Soviets did. It's not what the Soviets did, by the way. What the Soviets did was took over a peasant country and tried to rapidly copy Western technology to build steel mills and aircraft and military weaponry and so on, and industrial farms. But he says that there's a technological rationality to the technology itself of capitalism, and that technological rationality continues with as you transition from capitalism into socialism, thus condemning the socialism to import all of the negative externalities of capitalism, whether that's environmental degradation, whether that's exploitation and abuse through factory labor and so on. And he says what's actually needed to complete the revolution properly is a new technological rationality, or a totally new technology that's designed around the purposes of socialism. And so I want to point out that that's where we are. Let me give you some examples. So social media is obviously an example, and as Robert Malone calls it, what does he call it? Surveillance capitalist model. Social media is only off the ground financially because they spy on us and they sell the data that they acquire. There's basically no way that they could have made money with this when it was first getting started, especially. There was no way. I mean, maybe Elon's going to crack the code. I don't know. But before that, there was no way. When Facebook busted out on the scene, there was no way that they were going to be able to make a ton of money off of that. But the intelligence communities knew that they could use it as a spy tool. And then as long as Zuckerberg was willing to sell the data, they were in business, and that gave a profitable model to Facebook, and it gave the intelligence networks exactly what they wanted, but it also gave marketers what they want, and so on. So all the people that buy data and go off and sell futures, including futures of you, individual personal futures, being able to bet on you, are all able to profit off of that. So that's a new technological rationality that's actually geared towards socialism, but nothing compared to what you see. Well, let me just mention, there's a lot geared toward socialist models in ed technology, which is a lot driven by AI, but nothing in this, nothing compares, not even close to the technologies behind a social credit system and a central bank digital currency. So those are new technologies that carry a rationality of socialism, particularly social credit. At some point, I know I read part of it before, at some point I might actually explore the document from the Chinese Communist Party about the development of the social credit system and what its purpose was, but they are explicit that it is necessary for the building of socialism. So it is the technological rationality used to condition people into and constrain people into a socialistic model, and to optimalize that model around the people. So we're talking about that. I'm looking at this at present while I'm recording this. This will be dated at some point. I'm looking at the strike of at the ports, the longshoremen or whatever it is strike that's going on, and it's a big problem. And one of the proffered solutions by the left government and by the woke right, including, for example, the neo-reactionary character or dark enlightenment character Curtis Yarvin, is that we should just develop the AI ports, fire everybody, give them a severance package, and develop the AI ports like they have in China. They have basically few to zero people working at them, and it's all done by AI and all done by machine, 0 people employed. And then we would have this new high-tech super port system, which isn't that convenient, right? Just like they have in China. Well, guess where that technology is coming from, ladies and gentlemen? Did you guess China? You did. You guessed China. That's right. So guess what? That's going to be spy technology. That's going to be the Chinese having control over our ports. And so that's another scary example. Here's another scary example. All this green energy bullshit that we all know doesn't work. Instead of, gas and coal and nuclear, which can be quite decoupled from carbon emissions. Instead of those, we're having fucking windmills. Like, come on. And solar panels and all this other crap. And we all know it doesn't work. And we all know that it's a disaster at this point. Well, not everybody, but people are catching on that it's not working, right? It's kind of a disaster. Even major, left-leaning publications are starting to publish it. Maybe this is actually going to destroy our economy. Maybe net zero means economic disaster. Right? Well, what is that? That's a technology that basically requires a socialistic government in order to be able to work. It's not work. But I have to get further into one-dimensional man to make sense of why that is a different kind of technology with a different technological rationality. But let me make it very clear in a very visceral way. 16-year-olds, when I was a teenager, looked forward to being able to buy a car and go fill it up with 75 cents a gallon gas and be able to go be free and independent individuals exploring the world. And that's not possible with all of this scarcity, energy scarcity, how expensive everything is, and with friggin' electric cars and greater energy scarcity as a result of this so-called green energy push, and mix it with electric cars. It's a disaster. You don't have any of that. So that independent spirit now we're like, maybe we need trains. Maybe we need mass transit. That's a socialist solution, ladies and gentlemen. So it's a technological rationality towards socialism. But more importantly, one of the things that Mark Cruza talks about in One Dimensional Man are the failures of socialism and capitalism both. And his very short version of his argument is primarily about capitalism in this book, in Essay on Liberation, and he talks more about the failures of socialism, so we'll come back to that. The failure of capitalism isn't that it's unable to produce. In fact, it's very good at producing. It gives people a good life. The problem is that it produces too much, and what overproduction does is it produces what he says are false needs. So you lose track of your true needs, right? Do you really need this other gadget? Do you really need this other little trinket? Do you really need this other little, creature comfort or whatever it is? No, you don't. But you think you need it because you have false needs inculcated into you by both the culture industry selling you the idea that you need this stuff to have a better life, and also because you become dependent on having access to all of this stuff. Quick, reliable delivery, 3-day, 2-day, 1-day delivery, for example, sometimes same-day delivery. We're getting kind of accustomed to that. Well, that's a false need, according to Herbert Marcuse. You don't need that to live. You don't go and get it yourself, or maybe you just don't need it right now, or maybe you don't need it at all. And like his whole argument is that capitalism generates false needs that become mistaken for true needs. Then it generates more false needs that become mistaken for true needs. Then it generates more false needs that become mistaken for true needs. And so that the whole thing is eventually going to tip over. It's going to be unsustainable. So all this sustainability bullshit tech that we look at is socialist technical rationality. And he's actually talking about the need for technology and a technological rationality that leads towards sustainability and the identification of true needs from false needs. And then he explicitly puts a period on it by saying this totally means a reduction in the average standard of living. We are supposed to live happily with less. So I remind you that UNESCO has published, I did a whole podcast series about the strange death of the university, if you recall, and UNESCO began that document by talking about Herbert Marcuse and one-dimensional man. So they know this logic, and I point out that these are the same people through their sustainable development goals. UNESCO, the UN and UNESCO is United Nations. Their sustainable development goals are the degrowth sustainability model that effectively Marcuse was calling for, and they're trying to figure out how to put a bridle on capitalism in order to prevent capitalism from being unsustainable. And that requires this new technological rationality. That's his argument. So in that regard, we live in the logic of one-dimensional man. The other piece of one-dimensional man is, well, I told you, you're one-dimensional, so you need a second dimension to your thought in order to be able to navigate the world correctly. And he guesses as to what the second dimension of thought is. Ding, ding, ding. You're right. Critical theory. Critical theory is the way that you have to think about things so that you can learn to see how everything's problematic. In other words, you can wake up to something we might call a critical consciousness as opposed to just a class consciousness in a very similar way to what George Lukács outlined about class consciousness. We won't elaborate. So the next major work I want to talk about from Marcuse is called Essay on Liberation. The Essay on Liberation was published in 1969. So in a minute, when we go to repressive tolerance, I'm going to go backwards in time to catch that. But I want to talk about this because he actually talks about that same problem. I said the failures of socialism and capitalism are touched upon. Those are developed in Essay on Liberation. Just to point out, by the way, the first chapter of Essay on Liberation is called A Biological Foundation for Socialism. And the object of that is to force the false needs out of people and to create a situation in which they need socialism to survive at the level of their vital needs. So they are biologically and psychologically transformed into socialists by necessity, by leaning on them and creating a world experience that requires them to have socialism. So you might think of things like I just mentioned, a social credit system. You might think of universal basic income and a social credit system tied to that, or a data extraction method tied to that in order for you to be able to get the your needs met, to be able to earn a living. You have to play ball. And that is going to, in the second chapter, that creates a biological foundation for socialism at the level of your vital needs. And that is going to, he says in the second chapter, generate a new sensibility of life. And I've identified the new sensibility he's calling for as sustainability and inclusion. He talks a lot about, in that essay, the injustices around race, sexuality, sex with feminism, and so on, but primarily race and racialism. This being 1969, so it would have been on the tip of everybody's tongue. Let's be historically fair here. But also the sustainability idea, because he talks about, so inclusion equals solidarity across all axes of oppression. So you see the seeds of intersectionality. But sustainability comes from the failures of socialism and capitalism. His view is, and he's articulate about this, that socialism has the right idea but cannot produce. Capitalism does produce, but it produces wrongly. It produces unsustainably. It produces too much. It produces in a way that's not inclusive. It is exclusive to certain marginalized groups. Ghetto populations, as he refers to them, are unable to access the full fruits of the capitalist program. So capitalism, in order to be fixed, and it should be fixed, it has the advantage that it's productive. And socialism in the world as it exists is not. So it's doing something right. It's solved the question of productive forces. But the problem with it is that it produces wrongly, and of course that it maintains private property. And the way that it produces wrongly is that it produces unsustainably in the long run, and it produces exclusively or without a full actual equity model, as the Soviets would have called it. So capitalism has to be bridled by sustainability and inclusion. And socialism, on the other hand, has to figure out how to be productive. It has to figure out how to unleash the productive forces in an accurate way. And so this actually calls for a need for a dialectic between socialism and capitalism, to see them as two roads rather than seeing them like Marx did in sequence of, feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism as part of that 6-stage progression of history and the science of history. Let's see it now as feudalism to industrialization on to communism. Okay, or socialism, whatever you want to call it. So you have this stage of industrialization, and industrialization can take a socialist or a capitalist track, and that those two need to be dialectically synthesized, so to speak. They need to be mixed together in some effective way to spit out the road to communism. And that is what we see implemented a decade later in China. By the end of the 1970s, a decade later, that's the model that gets built by Deng Xiaoping working with David Rockefeller, working with Henry Kissinger. Rockefeller and Kissinger would have been clearly aware of Herbert Marcuse's ideas, and every reason to believe that they were solving the problem of production for China so that the West could allegedly profit off of that by opening up a fascist market inside of a communist political structure. And that's exactly what you would expect to see if you were to somehow have a socialist stage before the idealized communist stage, in a model where you are now synthesizing socialism and capitalism as pathways to industrialization, one that can produce and one that is ideologically directionally correct. And so that's exactly what Essay on Liberation is about. Biological foundation for socialism, leading into a new sensibility of sustainability and inclusion. The way that works in practice is that through solidarity, ESG, social justice, environmentalism against climate change, sustainable development goals, and so on in the West, you are going to degrow. You're going to take capitalism back from the brink. It's gone too far. We're going to put a bridle on it and pull it back. You're going to make sure that wealth is redistributed. We're going to make sure that we have everything going on with the social justice aspect and the climate change aspects and so on. And we're going to pull it all the way back. Maybe we'll break it with a public health crisis first. Maybe we'll break it with everybody's out of work for a couple of years and we're going to force them to get shots and all this crazy stuff to introduce new technological rationalities onto them. And then we're going to kind of restart it in a new way. We're going to build back better the whole program. Marcuse didn't write about that, by the way, just to be clear. But you can see how that actually got implemented. And so you're going to have this ESG model that's shrinking back the West and making it sustainable and inclusive. And meanwhile, you're going to have the unleashing of the productive forces in the socialist powerhouse of the world, which is China, by combining a fascist or literally national socialist economic model under the basic spirit of communism, which is what Deng Xiaoping theory literally is based on. Basic spirit of communism, but people are allowed to operate for profit large businesses so long as the government owns the heavy capital and the land upon which they operate and the raw materials, which is communism mixed with fascism. We've called it communo-fascism in the past. We've called it lots of things. Communism 3.0 or 21st century communism or corporate communism or corporatist communism are all good words for it. So that's the basic idea of SCN liberation, with one key piece left out so far, which is where he talks about how advanced capitalism stabilizes the working class. So what is his solution? He says it makes them counter-revolutionary, conservative. They're stabilized. Well, stable people don't revolt. Stability repels revolutions. You need unstable people to revolt. That's why you have to go psychologically break them into the biological foundation for socialism. So what does he say you need if the working class is stabilized and not going to be the basis of revolution? Simple. Easy. If the working class isn't going to do it, you need a new working class. That's exactly what he says. In fact, those are his exact words. There's a need for a new working class. And the new working class he identifies is located in the ghetto populations who are not fully benefiting from the fruits of a insufficiently inclusive capitalist system. The ghetto populations are what he names them. So that particularly refers to racial minorities, but he also names sexual minorities and outsiders and feminists. And he says that the student body, the student intelligentsia, are actually the organic intellectuals of this program, and they're to work together with the radicals that are also organic intellectuals. So that the job of the students, the radicalizable students, is to bring leftist theory to the organic intellectuals inside the radical movements like the Black Panthers and feminism and so on, and to make sure that their theory aligns with liberationist socialist theory. Okay, so that is the big project there. So we're going to get a new working class. Now, not only does that set the stage for our intersectionality, race Marxism, queer Marxism, feminist Marxism, and so on, that we've dealt with since the 1960s in the United States, it also removes any loyalty that Marxists had to workers. And once you remove loyalty to workers, you've now opened the door to utilizing a power structure that Marxists have locked themselves out of through all of history up to this point: corporate power. And like I said, like I just explained, that's where you get that's where you get the Dungism, the ESG, environmental social governance, and the sustainable development goals are Western Dungism. Dung is, by the way, so you kind of pronounce it. It's D-E-N-G, if you want to look him up. Deng Xiaoping, D-E-N-G-X-I-A-O-P-I-N-G. Deng Xiaoping. Okay, so I've spelled it for you. You can look him up. So Deng Xiaoping theory is the name, or Dungism, or as we call it in Western world, the Western Dungist model is ESG and the Sustainable Development Goals. But with no loyalty remaining to workers, because you have a new working class, and those idiots are going to be shepherded through because they're not going to organize and they're actually counter-revolutionary now, you can create a managerial vanguard. You can create an expert class vanguard that's going to use corporate power, use fascist power to drive us through to create the biological foundation for socialism and the new sensibility throughout the population that would allow you to install the new technological rationality that will socialize people into the new socialist model of liberation and give you the opportunity for your utopian revolution that he sees just over the horizon. Thank you. That's the model. That's how it happened. That's how it changed. That's where Marxism underwent the crucial change of the 20th century. And if you didn't know that, you can't possibly understand what's going on now. And you're lost when you're like, James, it's not Marxism, or whoever else. It's not Marxism. It uses corporations. You don't know what the fuck's going on, basically. And it happened in 1969, so it's time to catch the fuck up. Not to be rude, but seriously, it's time to get with the program. You're not helping with your trying to be smarter and saying it's not Marxism. You're missing the literal entire picture. And then, like I said, a decade later, this got taken by the U.S. State Department and David Rockefeller to China and implemented as a test model in China, in the People's Republic of China, through Deng Xiaoping, who saw the strategic advantage it would give him. And that's how you get to the Communism 3.0. Go listen to that podcast. Okay, we got two Marcuses left to go to finish this unit. Repressive Tolerance comes out in 1965 as a chapter in the book Critique of Pure Tolerance. Herbert Marcuse writes in Repressive Tolerance effectively that there are three types of tolerance that you can talk about in a society. So what he's looking at, let's back up before we talk about this. What he's looking at is classically liberal societies in general, but it could be any kind of society because it could be a fascist society too. Okay, so he's looking at, or a traditional society or a feudal society. We're going to say classical liberal for the moment. He's looking at the situation and he's looking at the concept of tolerance. What will a society tolerate? Well, the fly in the soup of a classical liberal, the hard problem of classical liberalism, that's what we should really call it. Maybe I'll do a podcast about this someday. The hard problem of classical liberalism, which, by the way, it doesn't mean unsolvable. We're not woke right doomsday losers who've given up on the Constitution and liberty because they don't know how to solve this. We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. We're not whiners. The hard problem of classical American liberalism is the paradox of tolerance. John Stuart Mill was unable to resolve it. He tried in his book On Liberty. Now, he wasn't an American. He was British. But he was unable to resolve it in On Liberty and punted and said basically that in the page 2. So it's not like it's buried in there and not that important. That at some point you just have to use authority to kick people's asses if they aren't going to do the right thing. Karl Popper did a little bit better with it. I'm not going to do the full discussion of everybody, but Karl Popper outlined the so-called paradox of tolerance in 1945, so 100 years after John Stuart Mill. He outlines the paradox of tolerance in a footnote, one paragraph in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And what he basically says is that there's a paradox to tolerance, that if you are too tolerant of the intolerant, eventually the tolerant will be destroyed by intolerance. So you can't be tolerant of intolerance, or eventually you'll be destroyed. But if you are intolerant of intolerance, you're intolerant, so you're not tolerant. So that's the paradox. There's no resolution to that. And I'm calling the paradox of tolerance the hard problem of classical liberalism. If you are going to allow people freedom, if you are going to grant them their liberty and secure their liberties, and consider that the just use of government, then you run into the paradox of tolerance, which is that you are the hard problem of classical liberalism, which is that you are going to run into intolerant factions trying to seize power without good ways to box them out of power. And using force becomes intolerant and somehow illegitimate. And this is a hard problem to solve, but I believe it can be solved, at least in practice. It might be a moving solution. Popper only gives it a paragraph's treatment, and his treatment is not very adequate as a result. And his paragraph essentially says that when you have an intolerant movement that's now organizing and moving beyond the stage of mere words to take up weapons and make direct threats, then it's time to exercise intolerance to box them out. But people have noted, and he was answering, how did the Nazis happen, writing in 1945. People have noted that you can whip up a huge problem that's basically unsolvable without ever getting to the violent rhetoric. You don't ever have to get to the violent rhetoric to get a big enough movement that it can now take control and then become violent after the fact that it's taken control. So it's not an adequate solution. I think that the key is solving this. So here comes Herbert Marcuse in Repressive Tolerance in 1965, and he's not going to solve this problem. He's going to hijack it. And that's very important because we live in the logic of repressive tolerance. I read this for the first time in 2019. My life was changed immediately. I realized this is the world we live in and this is the monster we're fighting. And that's how I realized the problem we called woke, which I thought was mostly postmodern, was in fact Marxist. And I had to get to the bottom of it. So this is an extremely important essay, and it's pure totalitarianism. And what he's actually doing is staring down the paradox of tolerance and hijacking it for leftist ends. So what he argues is that there are three possible organizational on the broad strokes ways of thinking about tolerance. He calls one democratic tolerance. He doesn't actually define it, but you get the idea that it's generally what people will tolerate. It's like a floating window of tolerance. And then in addition to democratic tolerance, there's this thing called repressive tolerance that gives the essay its title. And repressive tolerance is what repressive societies do. They draw strict lines and say, you can't be this way, you can't be that way. That's abnormal, that's perverted, that's weird, that's inappropriate, that's outside of the bounds of politeness or whatever. So if you're up on your Rousseau, this is starting to sound very Rousseau, rebel against the social contract kind of stuff. Everywhere man is born free and everywhere he's in chains, and the chains are actually the social expectations put on you. Well, here it is. Repressive tolerance is not going to tolerate too much of being weirdos. It's 1965, so if you want blue hair, you're a weirdo, that's not okay. Somebody's going to beat you up. If you're going to be homosexual, somebody might beat you up. If you're going to be racial minority and advocating for rights, somebody might beat you up. That kind of thing. That's a repressive society, a repressive form of tolerance. They only tolerate that which they actually tolerate, and everything else is going to be repressed. And he says most of the essay is about how rotten that is. But his actual argument is that in practice, and of course this is how Marxists would do it, because they mix things that aren't the same and treat them like they are the same in order to advance their opinion. He says that in order to understand what's going on, is that in a democratic society, that's actually how it already works. Democratic tolerance, what people will generally tolerate, without having just a wide open field of anything goes, what people will generally tolerate is automatically a repressive tolerance. They repress anything they won't accept, right? So he's taken the idea of like state repression by force to cultural repression by force, and by, in fact, other cultural shunning and shame and all of this stuff. Mix them together. So he says repressive tolerance is obviously right out. That's basically, in fact, he says it's straight up fascism. He doesn't mince words on that. It's fascism, maybe not explicitly, but on a way. So he says you have basically then repressive tolerance in every society unless it adopts what he calls liberating tolerance, which is a totally new way to look at tolerance. And it's the opposite of repressive tolerance. You could define repressive tolerance, although he doesn't, as a very limited range of tolerance. In fact, by nature, that which tolerates the status quo and nothing outside of it. Liberating tolerance is meant to liberate you from the status quo. So liberating tolerance, in his own words, is defined as extending tolerance to movements from the left and withdrawing tolerance from movements from the right. Now, because we've been doing podcasts on Lenin, you recognize immediately that that's the role of the dictatorship of the proletariat under Lenin and under Marx and under Mao and the democratic centralism that Lenin and Mao set up. It's the same program, but now it's not done by the state. It's allowed by the state. Maybe it's even favored by the state, but it's actually enabled at the cultural level. If it's leftist, it has to be tolerated because it's in the name of liberation. And if it's against leftism, in other words, rightist, it has to be stopped. And that's not even a good definition for rightism. He goes on to say in this essay, in fact, that the thought must never enter the mind of the potential reactionary. Therefore, it requires not just censorship, but also something he calls pre-censorship. I think that therefore explains all of this social media suppression and censorship, but also the way the algorithms will prevent you or lead you to see certain information, and what they call the attempts to suppress disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. The thought must never enter the reactionary mind, so misinformation has to be dealt with. And that logic is clear and present here, and the technological rationality in order to control it is actually implemented upon us already, and we feel it. So that's the world that we actually live in. He actually advocates that. He says violence is always unethical, but when has the changing of history or the movement of history ever been concerned with ethics? In other words, he justifies violence to movements from the left and withdraws it movements from the right. We've talked in other podcasts about how that was in Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, that the Red Guard were given a direct order from the Cultural Revolution group and Mao that nobody was allowed to stop them or arrest them. Even the police, if the Red Guards were beating a police officer to death,
they were not to be stopped. And we had this two-tier policing. Well, we see that now, especially with illegal immigrants and sometimes legal immigrants who have become problems in Western countries. I hear a lot from Britain about that right now, a lot from Europe, but we also see it here in the United States where people are getting off with very, very leftists and illegal immigrants, people that are basically favorable to democratic interests, are getting off on crime and allowed to get away with it. This is reproducing the conditions of the Cultural Revolution, and the logic of it comes in the West comes from repressive tolerance from Herbert Marcuse. So it turns out in 68 and 69, as a matter of historical reference, there was an attempted cultural revolution in the United States, and it failed out through the West too. May 1968, there was giant riots in Paris, and it failed. And so in 1972, Herbert Marcuse was pissed off, and he wrote a book called Counter-Revolution and Revolt. And in that book, I'm not going to go into the details of it. I'm only going to mention that he explicitly calls for what Rudi Dutschke called the Long March Through the Institutions, by name, invoking Dutschke, and naming the Long March Through the Institutions. And he says what that is basically going back to Gramsci. Like I said, the seeds of all of this are there. That what he says is going to happen is that everybody needs to go into the various professions and bring their ideology with them. The idea is now, we're going to take the effect the culture produce. Remember, the target of critical Marxism is the culture industry itself. Now he's saying, shit, that didn't work. We have to also do the cultural infiltration model of cultural Marxism. And he says in particular that the infiltration has to take place. He mentions computer programmers. He says you go in and you do the job. You're a computer programmer. But while you're there, you're a Marxist. So you're always spreading Marxist ideology. So you're not like a radical washout who's protesting on the street and refusing to go to work. Now you're going in and getting a job and being an agitator, just like Lenin's idea of bringing agitation into all classes and the agitprop. Well, now this is what you're going to do, but you're also going to do your job. You're going to put on your suit. You're going to dress like a Republican so you can speak like a anarchist, as the saying sometimes goes. But he says most importantly, this has to happen by going into all levels of education. And so that's where you see the Long March Through the Institutions no longer being in the streets, but rather going into K through 12 education, colleges of education, and universities overwhelmingly, which obviously we all are familiar with at this point, and I don't need to elaborate on. And that was Critical Marxism, Unit 3. I don't want to drag this out forever, but we do have to talk about woke Marxism. We're at 2.5 hours. I thought I could do this in 2. Boo. So woke Marxism is the Marxism of today. This has grown out of the critical Marxist turn in the 60s, particularly the Marcuse's turn, as it infused through students, Marcuse to students, students to radical activists in groups like the Black Panthers, feminists, and so on. And there's been this revolving door in the whole buildup of woke Marxism back and forth between the activist world and between the academic world. And it's very important. Did it come from academia? Yes. Did it come from activists? Yes. Were they in a revolving door? Yes. Were most of the activists PhDs? Well, maybe not most of them, but an awful lot of them. Most of them were educated or highly educated, going back and forth in a kind of a revolving door between academia and academics. That's why we called them scholar activists. Or activist scholars. I don't remember which way we phrased it. But both are right back in Cynical Theories when I wrote that with Helen. So the target of woke Marxism is different. Woke means you woke up to something. I'm having this argument right now trying to define the woke right. Woke means you woke up to something. You woke up to a new consciousness of the world. And that consciousness is predicated on the idea that the world is structured by systems of power that exclude people like you, group identity. The world is constructed by systems of power by a ruling class to exclude people like you. That's what you woke up to. That's why woke right works. By the way, the woke right realized that the world has been constructed by systems of power to exclude people like them, Christians, white, male, and so on. And they've leaned into that identity victimhood even more than they've leaned into understanding the theory of agitation that's driving them and the dialectical process that's pushing them to adopt that perspective. But the goal of woke Marxism, the target, I should say, is to transform individual consciousness. It's not just to awaken class consciousness or even a critical consciousness. It's now every individual is going to have their consciousness woke up to understand that they are part of some set of groups or some group. If you're in a set of groups, you're in a group too.
You're in some group that the system has been rigged to be unfair to, or that is the group that is unfairly benefiting from that arrangement. So everybody's going to be seen in terms of group identity, but you are going to have a personal awakening now. It's not just taking on class consciousness and solidarity. You're going to have a personal awakening. In other words, you're going to be born again, or as Paulo Freire put it, born again on the side of the oppressed. Dead, you die to your old identity and are reborn on the side of the oppressed. And this actually derives particularly from Mao Zedong and his push through cultural transformation through the late 1950s and then through the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. It was heavily derived from Mao, who was looking for a ideological remolding, a thought reform, a brainwashing, a personal transformation. Remember when I said earlier with the transcendent Marxism of Karl Marx and Economic Philosophic Manuscript that there had to be a qualitative change of who you were? Well, that's actually what the biological foundation for socialism and new sensibility of Herbert Marcuse was, is that there had to be a qualitative change of who you were. That's why the socialist societies failed to transform with their captured technological rationality, is they didn't have a qualitative change, according to Herbert Marcuse. Woke Marxism is designed to create that qualitative change in the individual. It is a born-again revival religion of Marxism. It's born-again Marxists. That's what woke Marxism is. Its primary feature that we would recognize is intersectionality, which derives directly from Herbert Marcuse through people like Angela Davis. Angela Davis was a radical black activist who was his PhD student. She said she was radicalized twice, once under Marcuse and once in Palestine, so there's that connection for you. And she inspired a range of black feminist activists, including the members of the Combahee River Collective, who penned the first idea that race, sex, class, sexuality, and so on, they were black feminist lesbians, socialist Marxists or something, who they said that race, sex, class, all of these things are interwoven, interlinked. They did not use the word intersectional. That term comes from Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. Kimberly Crenshaw named it in 1989, I believe. Her more famous paper is 1991, so that gives you some timeline. The Combahee River Collective was in the mid-1970s. I think they made their manifesto in 77. I did a podcast about it where all the details are right. I'm just doing this from memory. So 77 to 89, it kind of fomented in academic and activist circles. Crenshaw codifies it in 89, strengthens it in 91. Patricia Hill Collins' first book, which is called Black Feminist Thought, that touches on this issue, is in 90. And then she had another book, I think 93, that was called Intersectionality. And again, this is on the edges of my recollection, so fact check me. I might be wrong. I apologize. But what they developed was an American Maoism. They imported Mao's identity politics using American civil rights identity categories. That's literally what they built. Marcuse's ghetto populations became the basis for a Maoist identity politics. Now, I've talked about the Maoist identity politics before. I'll very briefly summarize. This is too long already, and I've got a lot to cover still, as it turns out, to get through woke. So here's the basics. Mao's identity politics, Mao separated the population into two groups. The enemies of the people were coded black. The people were coded red for communism. So the people were the good ones, and they were listed as the laborers who carry hammers, the peasants who carry sickles, and then revolutionaries of various sorts, revolutionary leaders, revolutionary soldiers, so people in the People's Liberation Army, revolutionary martyrs, people who died for the cause. Revolutionary leaders were sometimes called cadres, however you want. So you had these two token categories plus a bunch of revolutionaries. And so you couldn't join the token categories very easily, but you could become a revolutionary. Then on the other hand, the black categories were listed as enemies of the people, and they were rich farmers, which meant really still being super poor, landlords. We still hate landlords because you have to overcome all feudalism. That was a big deal in Mao's China. And then counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, as they were called, and right-wingers. So you can hear how that structure was all laid out. You have then
these kind of scapegoats, the landlords and the rich farmers who really didn't do anything wrong except happen to own certain things, and they get bullied and mistreated. And then you have the enemies of the state that are actually your counter-revolutionaries, whatever the hell a bad element is. I think we call them conspiracy theorists and so on today. And then right-wingers in general. And the goal was to hound the rich, to hound the people in general in the name of counter-revolutionary activity, in order to scare them to want to pledge to socialism. And the way that you'd get them to pledge to socialism was they couldn't become one of the token classes, they had to become a revolutionary. So you were building your revolutionary army in that way by basically abusing the population in the name of counter-revolutionary elements, which were relatively small, to push the masses of the people to join the revolution, to become revolutionary cadres, or at least party members, or at least on the road to socialism, and to engage in, for Mao, ideological remolding. Especially if you were an intellectual, you had to transform your thinking to be in line with the Maoist, what they called Mao Zedong thought, which was later sometimes described as Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics. So American Maoism is Mao's identity politics with American civil rights identity categories. So instead of having the tokens be laborers and peasants, your tokens now become people of color, particularly black or indigenous, sexual minorities, gender minorities, women, sometimes when they're not oppressors because of trans, and so on. And then your revolutionary classes become allies, activists, various types of radicals, Antifa, anarchists, trans, queer identities. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you have the people that get targeted unfairly that are like rich farmers and landlords, the scapegoat classes, and those are like white people, straight people, men, and so on. And then you have the people who actually fight against woke. Those are the counter-revolutionaries and right-wingers and deplorables and conspiracy theorists and so on. And you see the exact mapping under intersectionality of this onto new identity categories that aren't constructed out of basic communist theory applied to peasants, but are constructed instead out of American civil rights identity categories. Now, none of this really gets off the ground. Critical theory was really stuck without two influences, one of which is postmodernism. This is not a podcast in which I'm going to elaborate on postmodernism. I never actually end up going into detail about postmodernism. And the other is critical pedagogy or education theory. And really, critical pedagogy is where woke was born, because it mixed all this crap together. The activists were doing intersectionality, but frankly and honestly, education theory is where the ideas really took their shape, because the whole point was to figure out how to create individual consciousness awakening through educational processes in schools and workplace trainings. How about that? So let me talk briefly about postmodernism. Postmodernism is, in a sense, a Marxist theory. This is maybe a high-level way to put it. It's a belief that, how do I put this? Symbols, knowledge itself, is all an instrument of power. And in fact, I was going to say it's a Marxist theory of meaning making. That's maybe too abstract. Certain people are allowed to put meaning into symbols. What does this book mean? What does calculus mean? What does the stop sign really mean? What does the written word mean? What does this word, like the N word, really represent? What does this represent? What does that represent? What does this symbol? What does that symbol? What is this movie? What is this culture as a symbolic object? What does it all mean? Well, certain people have the power to set that, and those people are the powerful people. And then other people are excluded from that power and are forced to play in that playground that is set up that way. And so that creates an oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. But the deal is with postmodernism is everybody's sort of immersed into the power structure. And so nobody in particular has any knowledge of who is oppressed and an oppressor. So everybody's kind of both. And it's sort of this mixed up, confusing terrain in which actually reality just gets lost in a sea of images, and in a sea of symbols, and a sea of, your meaning making is no better than my meaning making. And
that which has been historically marginalized is often favored. What this actually builds out, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, is as it fuses with critical theory thinking, which was running alongside of it, and many of the same people had picked up elements of both, is it starts to adopt this idea that that which they don't want you to do is probably better, is probably more true. That which they don't want you to think is probably more accurate, more true. Anything that they say you should think is probably a unjust application of power and a lie. So that which has been historically marginalized is where you eventually get is probably more true. We call that, or it was called, I shouldn't say, it is called critical constructivism, which is an awful lot of damn words. So the key part of this, and people that listen to this are going to be pissed off at how bad my summary of postmodernism is here. I made 0 notes for this, so we're just winging. Critical constructivism has 2 pieces. Critical, which is critical theory, and constructivism, which is something to do with social constructs. Constructivism, social construct. Constructivism. So the idea of that is that the features of society are social artifacts. They're socially constructed. They are not real, and we are socialized into believing that they are real. Ding! Lukács's social reification becomes very real. We are that which we believe is true is actually only truthy, as Stephen Colbert had it. It's truthy as truthiness. It's not actually true. It's just that we generally agree to observe it as true or to consider it as true. That has a fancy term under the postmodern philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. He calls that the legitimation by paralogy. Paralogy is a false parallel logic. Paralogy. And legitimation by paralogy refers to legitimizing something through a fake parallel logic, and that fake parallel logic is essentially consensus. That's what we agree is true, is what we pretend is true. So everything is truthy, nothing is true. Therefore, there's your truth and there's my truth. And if we have to favor one truth over the other, that which has been historically marginalized was probably done so for nefarious reasons by power. So it's more likely to be true than not true. And that's how we do it. That's the social constructivist part of this. And then critical theory tells you that this is how we're going to look at it. So we're going to look for the existing unjust power structures and ruthlessly criticize them, not just as features of reality that deserve to be destroyed because all that exists deserves to perish, but also as social constructions that are arbitrary and subject to change. So that's a very important aspect of this, but we're not going to digress into postmodernism any further. I could talk about Foucault and his idea of power knowledge and biopolitics, and it's all very important for what we're living through right now. In fact, the COVID policy was all exactly what Foucault was warning about with biopolitics, where science steps in and tells you how the science, I should say, steps in and tells you how the world really works, but it's only doing so in order to entrench its own power and advantage. We just lived through that, but it's not cultural Marxism. It's too far afield. Plus, they weaponized it against us. So Foucault's critiques are actually almost exactly accurate to the COVID policies, and I can't really complain, even though I hate Foucault and his leftist ways. We need to talk about the development of woke far more about critical pedagogy. I just want to make the final point about postmodernism, though, that critical constructivism as the real grown-up name for woke, what you've woken up to is as it's described by its creator, a critical constructivist worldview. In other words, the world is constructed by systems of power. There is no shared reality between us. Each of us has a reality that's colored by our relationship or position with regard to power. That's the postmodern part. And that the correct way to deal with that is through critical theory type critique. And that is what woke really means. And if we're going to accept that that's what woke means, we have to recognize, for example, when Jordan Peterson used to call woke, what we call woke now, he called it postmodern Neo-Marxism. He was actually exactly correct. Critical theory or critical Marxism is also known as Neo-Marxism, and if you were to add a postmodern element to that, you would end up with a postmodern Neo-Marxism, and that would be the correct term for it. And so I encourage people to think about that it is critical theory done with a postmodern fast and loose about the truth, because there is no truth. There is only subjective truth that is located and established falsely by power that wishes to benefit from claims about truth, which is a completely subjectivist realm, which is far beyond the purely relative and self-serving realm of Marxism. It's much more negative and pessimistic than Marxism. Sometimes postmodernism is referred to as a post-Marxist theory that is actually even so negative that it abandoned Marxism. I think it's more accurate to say that it is, because it does criticize Marxism as having failed in hopelessness, but I think it's more accurate to say that it is a Marxist oppressor versus oppressed theory of meaning making and the assignment of meaning to symbols. In all abstract symbols. It's also a purely negative theology or completely negative dialectic, and it is supercharged in particular through Foucault's love of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's belief was actually that you become the Superman, the Übermensch, by breaking away from any restraint from morals. And so Foucault believed that morals are an arbitrary social construct, and if we could free ourselves from those and be liberated from them, we're not just going to free the libido baby, we're going to free everybody from everything. And you can just imagine that world. Okay, so critical pedagogy is where woke was actually born, and we did need to touch on that because eventually postmodernism gets mixed into education. I'll touch on that. But critical pedagogy actually derives from the education for liberation, as it was called, of the Brazilian Marxist Paulo Freire. I have done a bajillion podcasts on Paulo Freire, so I encourage you, if you're interested, I read one of his entire books as a podcast series, to go look him up. That is Paulo. Paulo. Freire is Freire. I encourage you to go look him up. Paulo Freire was a liberation theologian and a post-colonialist. So he lived in Brazil, Recife, Brazil specifically, and in the 1920s or 30s, I forget, his family was badly dispossessed by the colonization of Brazil. They were eating out of dumpsters and out of a landfill, and the stories are horrific. And I mean, he had a tough time. It's not good. And this ends up kind of radicalizing him in a post-colonial way. He starts to pick up some Marxist theory from one of his spiritual mentors, Dom Elder Camara, who was a communist bishop, originally actually Catholic integralist, who was fast-tracked to bishop status, then became a communist in Recife, Brazil. He became known as the Bishop of the Slums, or of the Favelas, or the priest of the slums. And so he started to learn some communism there, but he was primarily post-colonialist. But he developed a method of education. His goal was to teach these poor peasants who he saw being crushed by the imposition of colonialist capitalism. He wanted to teach them to read. And he came up with a method that is very unique to the Portuguese language. It might work in Spanish because it's so syllable-based, even though all he did was rant about syllables. But the primary thing that he did was he pushed this concept educationally called generative themes. And generative themes are emotionally engaging topics, so that how do you get the peasants to want to learn? This is where you talk about getting the kids engaged in our education today. How do you get them to want to learn? And you talk to them to find out what engages them. You extract from them what engages them, and then you generate what he called generative themes from that, which will generate political conversations. So maybe they live in a slum, so they're interested in the slum. So you teach them the word favela, and then you break it down into its syllables, and you talk about related syllables, and you teach them to read sounds one at a time. Okay, fine. That's his reading method. But what you actually do is along the way is to get them engaged. You get them talking about the slum, and then eventually you show them a picture of the slum, and you have them talk about their life, and you tell them why their life is that way. In other words, that's where the Marxist indoctrination or brainwashing comes in. And Freire said in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is his magnum opus from 1970, he says in it that he derives this method of education from that which was working under Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution of China. So that's the exact same ideological remolding. Now, to cut out all the BS about how it works, because no one cares about how it works for the rise of woke, what Freire said was that you hit people with these generative themes to get them emotionally engaged, then you describe the real concrete reasons, in other words, a Marxist interpretation for their emotional circumstance that they're looking at, And over the course of a number of these things, you conscientize them. Consciência to sachau or something like that in Portuguese. So you awaken them, you radicalize them by feeding them directly to their personal context, individual personal context, to awaken in them a Marxist understanding and a post-colonial understanding and a woke literally, this is where woke starts, right there. A woke understanding, a Marxist understanding of their individual circumstances, whether the oppression is race, whether it's environment, whether it's class, whether it's colonial status, it doesn't matter. Whether it's literacy status, that was a big one for him, it doesn't matter. You radicalize them around this and make them believe that you actually take them literally through George Lukács's stages of learning class consciousness, of radicalization, to radicalize them into what Freire called a critical consciousness, which extends way beyond class consciousness into understanding that revolution has to come about to overthrow these conditions, but then it must also be perpetual. There is no end to revolution. You constantly revolt and revolt, the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And he said that this all requires a personal transformation that he literally describes as a personal Easter. He says that there must be a death and rebirth of the individual on the side of the oppressed. You must die to your old self to be reborn on the side of the oppressed. And his disciple, Henry Giroux, who's a Canadian-American, or American-Canadian, I forget which way that works. He was in Boston or the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. He was in Rhode Island as a teacher when he stumbled on Paulo Freire and radicalized himself. He was already a leftist teacher. His conservative high school wasn't letting him do leftist teaching methods. A democratic classroom was something he was interested in. That's where the students are in charge, by the way. And you should be familiar with that at this point. And he finally gets in trouble for it, reads Paulo Freire, has a religious conversion. And he describes Paulo Freire's method as prophetic. That's the word he uses. And he says that it is prophetic in the sense that it calls us to build the kingdom of God here on earth in solidarity with the oppressed. Very close to a direct quote in the foreword to the book, The Politics of Education, which Henry Giroux wrote. Paulo Freire wrote The Politics of Education. Henry Giroux wrote the foreword, to be clear. And I've read that a bunch of times, so I don't have to elaborate. But just to give you a very clear indication that this is a religion, woke is a personal death and rebirth, a personal experienced Easter, according to Paulo Freire. And that is literally to build the kingdom of God here on earth by awakening consciousness through this radicalization process that Paulo Freire referred to as education for liberation. What Henry Giroux did was he took Paulo Freire's work, and not only did he mainline that into American colleges and Canadian colleges of education, largely by getting professors tenured in those. He called that his most important praxis. But he also incorporated his existing knowledge of what he referred to as the European theorists. That's a vague term like Herbert Marcuse's ghetto populations, but the European theorists primarily for Giroux include Herbert Marcuse and the postmodernist Jacques Derrida. He does do some with Foucault and the other postmodernists. He does a little bit with the other critical theorists, but his primary, because Freire already had Marx, Lenin, and Mao written through his stuff. His primary European theorists are Marcuse and Jacques Derrida. We're not going to talk about the Jacques Derrida and his post-structuralism here, which is a wing of postmodernism. We'll leave it be, but that's where the postmodern infusion it's one of the places that this happens. I mean, to get into the full details of this is like this could be like 10 podcasts. Giroux is responsible for mixing Paulo Freire's education for liberation with the European theorists. And what came out, along with the democratic classroom approach, which extended Freire's ideas and added his own, what comes out is called critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy is the model of education. Your kids go to schools that are ruled by critical pedagogy, which is why I say we live in Herbert Marcuse's world, and your kids go to Paulo Freire's schools. Critical pedagogy is called by that name still to this day, but we more frequently hear about it as culturally relevant teaching, which was in 1995 developed directly as a translation by Gloria Ladson Billings from critical pedagogy
into the domains like critical race theory specifically. In 1995, she wrote 2 papers about culturally relevant teaching and 1 paper called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. Those were her 3 major papers in 1995. That's a busy year for an academic. And you can see what the point is. But she's very clear that culturally relevant pedagogy is the extension of critical pedagogy into the domain of critical race theory. And so we frequently will hear it culturally relevant teaching, culturally relevant education, culturally responsive education, culturally sensitive education, culturally, cultural competence. These are all terms that you'll hear. Culturally relevant pedagogy. These are all just critical pedagogy using the American Maoist intersectional identity categories. And that is what our education is based on. And it comes directly from Paulo Freire through Henry Giroux, through Gloria Ladson-Billings, down to the present day. One other education theorist, and this is crucial to mention because of what I just talked about, is Joe Kincheloe. Joe Kincheloe worked under both, he died in 2008 or 9. He worked under both Henry Giroux and Paulo Freire. And he was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at McGill University in Canada, but I sometimes mess that up. I might have it wrong. But he is the creator of what was called the critical constructivism that I mentioned earlier, or critical constructivist epistemology. He wrote a book that's very hard to get a hold of. Our friend Logan Lansing managed to get one and has lent it to me basically maybe forever. I don't know. I need to give it back to him at some point, but I'm not done with it. Titled Critical Constructivism, where he lays this out. He says explicitly that it's a worldview. It's explicitly that reality is constructed by power. There's your constructivist part that needs critical theory. Thus, we can reconstruct reality according to our desires. This isn't a podcast to go into the full expanse of critical constructivism, but it's very important, and it is the formal name for woke. It is that you are believing that reality is constructed by systems of power that you are thrust into, so they construct you too. He explicitly calls it a worldview, which means a religion, and that you can use critical theory to reconstruct reality differently if you want. And so woke Marxism actually developed primarily, at least in academic circles, in 2 places. One is in critical pedagogy, and then another, which I'm not going to spend very much time on, is in feminism. Feminism is, in fact, the significant vehicle behind a lot of this. I'm not going to go into the development of queer theory directly out of feminism, which makes feminists very mad. Hags very mad. It's their natural habitat is being mad, so we'll let that be for the moment. But what feminism did was feminism was desperate to destroy the gender binary, and it appropriated any damn thing it could to do it. There's a whole Marxist feminist school. There are deep ties to Marxism and feminism. There's a lot of revolutionary feminism in that regard that all developed very heavily in the universities. So when we say that infiltrate education at all levels, we can talk about African American studies programs. We can talk about schools of education. Feminists in English departments did more of this than anybody. Actually, education in English departments. Feminists did this more than anybody. They brought more what we now recognize as woke into the university system, into law, than any other group, bar none. So they are while woke theory was forged in education, woke was built on the back of feminism. That's why it's so damn effeminate. That's why young women are so susceptible to it, while young men are much less. Young men only got into woke because they wanted to be able to date young women who got sucked into it, and now they've wised up and realized that's a doomsday trap for the rest of their lives, so they're not doing that anymore. The reason young women are so susceptible to woke is because woke is Marxism, cultural Marxism, that passed through the lens of feminism and was forged for application through the lens of critical education theory. That's why young women, it is a feminist reinterpretation of identity Marxism or identity Maoism. And so the feminists, for example, worked directly with, I'm just going to give you a bullet point summary here. They worked directly with the Frankfurt School members, for example, Herbert Marcuse, as I mentioned. The feminists were one of the outsider groups or ghetto groups he mentioned. The black feminists were direct inheritors of Herbert Marcuse's theories and philosophy, while many other branches of feminism did not actually inherit that. In fact, were smashed by the black feminists who invented intersectionality to smash other feminists.
specifically and to conquer them and consolidate power by accusing them of being racist for doing their feminism the way that they had been. Feminists, in their desperation to destroy the gender binary, imported French postmodernism from France into the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom and Australia. The first women's studies department was in Australia, as a matter of fact. But they imported postmodern theory because Foucault, to a degree, and Derrida, to a far greater degree, allowed them to deconstruct gender. Foucault allowed them to queer theory is more relevant there because Foucault allowed them to deconstruct sexuality and to link it to sex and gender, which they did. But the goal was to deconstruct gender roles or sex roles so overwhelmingly and to decouple sex and gender that they imported the postmodern deconstruction methods to do so, particularly at the English department at Yale. So the French don't like postmodernism. They don't look at it. They never really got into it. They always thought it was a bit goofy and intellectually showy. The only people who ever gave a rat's ass about postmodernism were two groups of people, and not the education theorists all that much. One, American or Western, I guess I should say American, somewhat Canadian, somewhat Australian, somewhat British, but American in particular feminists, and post-colonial theorists like Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha, which were deeply postmodernist in their interpretations of colonial theory, colonialism, and so on. They incorporated the post-colonial radicalism of Frantz Fanon and turned it into postmodern gobbledygook that is virtually unreadable, and got its foothold in the American university systems, which downstream from that is every bit of this Palestine, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel hate that we have going on right now. And those have always run in parallel. That's why you have the queer theorist and feminist Judith Butler to this day rambling about the need to be pro-Palestine. Okay, so the feminists imported most of the postmodernism. They were rampant in their critiques, although they didn't adopt nearly as much critical theory. Some of them, especially the black feminists, picked up most of Herbert Marcuse's methods, crushed the other feminists. There's like 30 branches of feminism, and they don't agree with each other. And the one that won out is intersectional feminism, period, the end. And that is the mixture of a little bit just enough of this postmodern theory to be able to do whatever they want and deconstruct whatever they want and take apart whatever they want and have their own truths, combined with an awful lot of Marcusean critical theory, especially in the race domain. And that got infused very rapidly into the educational system, so that the book, The Critical Turn in Education by Isaac Gottesman, published to tell the story of how our education system got captured by critical pedagogy, has this subtitle. It says, From Marxist Critique, which is the first couple chapters explaining that that didn't work. It couldn't get into American education. From Marxist Critique to post-structuralist feminism to critical theories of race. And so you can see the progression into education. And the last half of the book is talking about how basically the postmodern feminists, the post-structuralist feminists, stepped in and bulldozed their way into education, infused it with lots of postmodern theory into the education theory that was already tipping into the critical domain, and then critical race theory came in and kind of made it all intersectional in the end, in the early 2000s. So feminism and critical pedagogy were the forges of woke. And it really, most of the heavy lifting took place in education and in education theory, our poor children. So the flavors that came out of this, I'm not going to go into detail about these. Critical race theory is race Marxism. It reestablishes the oppressor oppressed by race. The idea is that the white people are like the bourgeoisie and they have a private property of whiteness, and it's going to be abolished into an enlightened state of anti-racism instead of socialism. People of color, and especially black and indigenous, are now immigrant, are the illegal immigrant specifically, are the proletariat that need to have an awakened racial consciousness. And you can see the whole picture. Queer theory is sexual Marxism. The dividing line is now actually not sexuality. That's a ruse. Or even so-called gender identity, which is fake, but also a ruse. The dividing line is normalcy. Are you considered normal? Is your presentation considered legitimate or not? And we could go on and on and on. Critical pedagogy is educational Marxism. Postmodernism is meaning-making Marxism. Disability studies is ability status Marxism. Fat studies is fat status Marxism with their whole fat genocide and body positivity bullshit. Climate change narrative is mostly environmental Marxism, where human beings writ large are especially Westerners and Americans, are the oppressor into the earth and the global south, and the developing nations and the third world are the oppressed. All this is cobbled together in intersectionality. By the way, the same model was used. The oppressor versus oppressed. The unvaccinated were oppressing the vaccinated by making sure that they lived in more disease and would have to get more shots. You get the whole picture. So this is actually intersectionality. Intersectionality is the culmination of our discussion on cultural Marxism through the entirety of its history. Just to kind of mop up where did we come from, we talked about what Marxism was. Then in the early 1900s, 1910s through the 1930s, we had cultural Marxism. Then through the middle part of the 20th century, a critical Marxism or critical theory phase, Neo-Marxist phase. And then from the 1970s forward, at least here in the West, cultural Marxism took on the form of intersectionality, which is what we deal with now, which mixes CRT, queer theory, climate change, disability studies, fat studies, women's studies, gender studies, your mom studies, whatever studies, all together under a single oppressive, they call it Patricia Hill Collins called it the matrix of domination, which sounds like something you have to pay for at some kind of weird club or something. So anyway, that is cultural Marxism in the West. That's a basic overview, tells you the whole story, long, a bit rambling. But the point of all this has been to open the gates of Western civilization to Marxist theory, because they were not going to be able to get a Russian-style revolution. They knew they wouldn't. Even with the Soviet Union at the height of its power, they knew they were never going to be able to force it. So that's why Khrushchev said that they were going to take America without firing a shot. And they had to break Western nations to be able to do that. And cultural Marxism has been working its way for over 100 years to be the tool to do that. And here we are at the point where it nearly succeeded. The point has become, in the meantime, because of the collapse of Soviet Union and the collapse actually of old school communist China to this new Deng Xiaoping model, to enable what I'm calling communism 3.0 or 20th century communism or corporate communism or corporatist communism, which is the China model, which they tested there. One country, two systems. You have a basic spirit of communist political theory mixed with a National Socialist fascist business practice. Very key. And that's being imported through the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations here in the West, in conjunction, by the way, with the CCP. They're working with them. And it's being enforced through ESG investment rules and corporate rules, environmental, social, and governance rules. The S in social justice is, in fact, most of the cultural Marxism of today, or the S in ESG, I should say, is social justice. And that's your Western Dengism or Dengism model. Western Dengism to match Eastern Dengism. And we're all supposed to have parallel models, the West doing it through ESG and sustainable development, which, by the way, is going to be replaced by resilient development goals. The SDGs will be replaced by the RDGs in the future. We'll talk about that at some point. That should see us through to 2050 of tyranny. And meanwhile, China is meant to continue to rise using this Deng Xiaoping model. And if you want to know what the West is supposed to look like as this develops under this cultural Marxism fully ripened approach into communism 3.0 or 21st century communism, imagine a Western model that it runs like China and basically looks like South Africa with nicer buildings, because that's more or less what we're headed for. So that's my basic introduction to Western Marxism, honestly, or cultural Marxism overall. It's fully an hour longer than I intended, so my night's ruined. I hope it's been edifying for you. I've been asked so many times to make, where do I start? Well, it's 3 hours long, but here's a place to start. You can tell your friends, you can show your friends, they can break it up in chunks. There were 4 discrete units. And like I said, if it's sufficiently popular, I can deep dive on each of these, and then we can deep dive on each part of each of these as well. We could have so much basic material. Thank you for listening. I'll do another, hopefully not nearly so long one again soon.